Greetings, my fellow Westorians. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashaya, and this is Valar Rereadis special late night edition. Thus, I'm wearing a Night's Watch shirt, because most of you who are watching this live, well, it's night, so y'all are the Night's Watch. I guess we're the Night's podcasters. This is the show where we look for the foreshadowing we missed, new depth in the world building, a better understanding of the plot lines, greater familiarity with the characters, and more fun than you can fit in all seven hells. And I hope it's extra fun doing it at night for some of y'all. I know that means that some of you who can't usually make this our live streams can make it because of this unusual time. We like to change it up like that every once in a while. And of course, this weekend we had gone to Nashville for a lovely event called Ball at the Wall, and it was a great success, lots of fun. So congrats to the organizers for throwing a successful event, and we had a great time. After this episode, we're going to record another Patreon special episode. Where Are They Now? It will be set on Team Stannis, and anyone who is a Patreon at any level can get access to those episodes. This will be the third Where Are They Now episode. But we also have lots of other types of bonus episodes like Gagossos and a couple other single chapter reviews. So thanks to anyone who supports us on Patreon. You make all of our live streams and scripted episodes and all of this possible. You are our anchor, our touchstone, our base of the high tower. And thanks to Maura Lee, who hit us with a super chat, sending love to us and the kitties, and saying she always looks forward to our live streams. But it was before we even started, so she was ahead of the game. Thanks to you, Maura.
Well, she was looking forward to it.
Right, looking forward to. So, that's the right. Get it in advance. That makes sense. You're right. All right, this time we have Catelyn 2. The gang fights for Rainbow Cloaks, a.k.a. the one where Brienne wins.
John 3, the one where there aren't any boys, aka the gang meets Craster and Gilly.
Theon 2, Theon tries to bang his sister, aka the gang starts a war.
Tyrion 6, the gang hears Stannis is fighting Renly, aka the one where Shagga's a barber.
Arya 6, the gang gets tickled, aka the one where Arya starts her list.
Daenerys 2, the gang finally learns Robert is dead, aka the one where they explore Qarth.
Yeah, and this should be the last in a series of what it looks like 3 in a row extra long Valar Rereadis episodes. The earlier chapters in the book are quite a bit longer on average than the later ones. This is most likely due to the presence and thus introductions for so many new characters and locations. Something doesn't happen nearly as much in the second half of the book. Once you get all the characters introduced, new locations, it's more about exploring and doing. Less introduction time. 6 of the 9 POVs in this book overall, looking at it from a high level, are on the move to new locations. Some of them stay on the move, like Theon and Jon, the entire book. Others, like Arya, get to Harrenhal, and Dany, who gets to Qarth, wind up staying in place at that new location the entire book. And we're covering both of those today, both Arya and Dany getting into those locations. They'll both stay in these new locations till the end, and like Arya flees Harrenhal, and Dany sets sail on the ship sent by Illyrio. And they're joined by Bran, not physically, but in that he stays in Winterfell all book long, only to leave in his last chapter as well. Tyrion and Davos and Theon all end the book in dire straits. 2 of them injured, the other literally in a strait. Well, okay, a bay, Blackwater Bay. Only Sansa stays put and doesn't leave, though as we'll see, a big part of her arc is plotting to leave. And only her mother, Catelyn, starts in one location, travels to several other locations, and then returns back to that first location. She goes Riverrun, Bitterbridge, Storm's End, and then back to Riverrun. And she's where we start today, with a perfect example of a chapter that gives us a lot of introductions without stinting on story. So here we go. Catelyn 2, the gang fights for Rango. The gang fights for... What does that mean? Oh, that's really good. Okay, good. Well, this is what happens with the late night streams. Apparently, I say words funny. The gang fights for Rainbow Cloaks, aka the one where Brienne wins. It's the one where we meet not only Brienne, but a lot of lords and knights from the Stormlands and the Reach, including Marjorie. Although a lot of them we don't see a whole lot about them. And there's too many of them for us to cover today because this is already an extra long episode, like I said. But a Where Are They Now is forthcoming to cover a lot of these characters. Besides so many new characters, there are also huge amounts of setup and foreshadowing in this chapter, and it's all filtered through Catelyn's internal suffering. She thinks how she wants a day, an hour even, to just weep and be comforted, but there is no time for that. Quote,
As she slept amidst the rolling grasslands, Catelyn dreamt that Bran was whole again, that Arya and Sansa held hands, that Rickon was still a babe at her breast.
well, the Bran and Rickon parts will never be, but maybe Arya and Sansa will hold hands. That could happen. A big part of this chapter, especially the beginning, is Rob's plan to head west. He realizes that time is helping Tywin more than it's helping him. And as he points out, when Kat challenges him on that, she says, well, you're just going to do what Tywin wants? He's like, no, we're going to go attack west, do what he does not expect. And indeed, he does not expect that. He never really, in all the plotting sessions we see with Tywin, that doesn't seem to be mentioned as a possible destination for Rob's army. We also hear a bit more about Kat's mother. Minissa went, but not under great circumstances. We wonder a lot about her because there hasn't been much said about her, and I suppose we probably never will learn a whole lot about her since we're not likely to have Cat POVs anymore. But so it comes up in relation to her father's dementia. He thinks she's Minissa. She thinks, meaning her dad thinks she's her mom. That's awkward. But it's also kind of in line with where Hoster's been for a while. He's, asking about Blackfish getting married, things like that. His mind is going. It's very sad.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that a great deal of readers can relate to, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I personally experienced it recently. Not personally myself, but in my family experienced it fairly recently. So I definitely understand it. There's a huge list of banners and houses here, like I said. Some of them we'll actually be quoting throughout this chapter coverage. And we have Renly sitting around not making war, just waiting. Kind of like how Tywin and Robb are in a holding pattern, and just like Stannis. It makes sense. Anyone who's played war games with your friends, a lot of times that's just how it goes. Everyone sits there and waits for someone else to commit, and then they react. Robb, in this case, is kind of the first one to make a move. And then Stannis finally makes a move as well, but it's not the move anyone expects. He attacks Storm's End, which surprises everyone. And, of course, Reread allows us to consider one of the early parts of this chapter much differently, meaning the tournament. We know a lot more about what's happening. Instead of being surprised by who this Blue Knight is, we know what's motivating her. We know why she's so great at fighting in particular on this particular day. Even though she's pretty darn good on any given day, she was as best as she's ever been this day, and that's not clear till several books later. Quote,
In the melee at Bitterbridge, she had sought out her suitors and battered them one by one. Pharaoh and Ambrose and Bushy, Mark Mullendore and Raymond Nayland and Will the Stork. She had ridden over Harry Sawyer and broken Robin Potter's helm, giving him a nasty scar. And when the last of them had fallen, the mother had delivered Connington to her. This time Ser Ronnet held a sword and not a rose. Every blow she dealt him was sweeter than a kiss.
So Brienne is kind of the opposite of the strategy we just described from all these top commanders. She's just going right for it and taking out all her people she's mad at one by one. She's not sitting back and waiting which is not an uncommon strategy in a melee where it's a huge free-for-all, letting a lot of people kind of expend their energy and go down and kind of cleaning up the mess afterwards would be a viable strategy. But Brienne just wades into the melee with ferocity from start to finish. Now, what we see is only the final four. And so all this stuff that she's described, now again, that was a quote from Feast for Crows, not from this chapter. And so this is all describing leading up to the point where we actually see. We see when it's down to 4, and the point she just describes is before that. She doesn't describe or remember defeating the last 2 before facing Loras individually. And also because of the rose given to her, the bet, and all that, she's particularly upset to facing Loras Tyrell. Quote,
Loras Tyrell had been the last to face her wrath that day. He'd never courted her, had hardly looked at her at all, but he bore 3 golden roses on his shield that day, and Brienne hated roses. The sight of them had given her a furious strength.
Yeah, I mean, dang. He just took her down, or she just took him down, and it was epic. So there are some serious dunk and egg parallels here. Well, maybe not the egg part, but the dunk, of course. There's the way that Brienne defeats...
She just dunks all over them.
The way that Brienne defeats Loras is very similar to how Duncan defeats Lucas Longinch in the second Dunk and Egg story, which is the Sworn Sword. They fight in the water, which is a bit different than fighting in a tournament, but Lucas is wielding a long axe, and Duncan beats him by grappling, getting in close and using his superior size and strength, which Loras is quicker and stronger than you would think, but in a wrestling match, it's not close. Brienne is large and strong and maybe not as quick as Loras, but, you know, overall, that's a position that much favors her. Now, we like to talk about comparisons to the actors and the characters occasionally to remind ourselves the difference. This is a good example of a small plot that had to be changed. Brienne does not look at all like Gwendolyn Christie. In the show, well, there's no Brienne the Beauty business where they mock her appearance, because that just wouldn't fly. You can't mock Gwendolyn Christie's appearance and have it be genuine. People are going to be like, what? What are you talking about? She's gorgeous, crazy people. So they just had to drop that. They had to drop that for a lot of characters, even though it was more of a more part of her character in the books. For example, Jorah is also made a lot more handsome, but his appearance doesn't really play a huge role in his character arc in the books.
Yeah, that's just TV. I will say Brienne is also older. Gwendolyn Christie is older than Brienne.
That's
in
true.
The books.
That's very
a
true.
Major thing in terms of when you read it and you think about it, you realize just how young she really is.
Yeah, and I guess that's a fairly common thing. We see a lot of the actors are older than their character in not just in Game of Thrones, but just in general. That's they just find younger looking people and cast them for young roles. Kat is horrified at finding out that Brienne is Brienne, that she's a woman. The choice of words is very interesting. Horrified. That's always really stood out to me, because to Catelyn it's so strange, and because it's so outside of normal society, and Kat's kind of
it's funny because her
sense.
Daughter is on that spectrum of fighting. One.
That's
and
true.
Two, assuming she met Lyanna Stark, she was also, and she's met other northern women like the Mormonts. She's met plenty of women that fight.
But she's never seen one like this, I think, slugging it out, wearing heavy mail and all that. Not that that's necessarily explains it, because I don't exactly know why she's horrified by it, but I think it's just the shock and the
maybe
a lot of things.
Maybe a northern person doing it is different to her than an actual southern person.
That's true. And to be fair about the Arya point, most of Arya's training begins at King's Landing, where Catelyn's not even present.
Yeah, but
still, Arya's got that attitude and all.
Yeah,
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I agree. So there's a lot of banter between Renly's lords, and Catelyn. Catelyn, I like the way she handles them. She points out that Robb is actually fighting, where they're just having tournaments, and that's a good way to kind of shut them up. Even Randall Tarley, who technically has been in war before, so he's no Knight of Summer, but most of this company is, and that's a big theme here. An interesting point comes up during this banter is Mathis Rowan, who is a character that will feature in the Where Are They Now episode on these guys, wonders why Jaime is still alive, wonders why they haven't killed him after Ned's execution. And Mathis Rowan will later look very frustrated with Tywin's hypocrisy in council, when he sort of has to blow with the wind like the rest of the Reach and sign up with either the Lannisters or Stannis once Renly is killed. And he, of course... Well, he at first chooses Stannis, but then goes over to the Lannisters after Stannis' defeat. And he's not happy about being with Tywin. He did not like the murder of the Targaryen kids. Yet, he's one of many who did not like that so much. Another person who didn't like that so much is Barristan. And, of course, he regrets not having done anything much later. It's something that haunts him. Now, Renly kind of hoped or even expected that Barristan would come to join him. And part of that is maybe silly that he would expect that because, well, Renly's a usurper, and why would Barristan join a usurper? But also, to be fair to Renly, we see early on in A Game of Thrones that they're pretty friendly with each other. They kind of hung out a little bit. They were laughing together early on. So it seemed like they may have had a bit of a connection, a bit of even maybe a friendship. Perhaps some respect, mutual respect. They're both Stormlanders, after all. But it wasn't enough. Renly points out to Catelyn that he was holding that extra Rainbow Guard slot for him, but it went to Brienne when Barristan didn't show up. The chapter, of course, ends with the news of Stannis showing up. That interrupts him giving Catelyn sort of a lesson, showing her how powerful he is. And, well, it's all, to me, I think this is interesting to think about the way Renly is behaving. It's very much a bread and circuses type situation here, where he's showing the power of Highgarden with these lavish feasts. There's some food porn in this particular chapter, but also he's having, the circuses. The equivalent of circuses are these tournaments where people are watching and they're excited and it's fun for them, even though this is supposed to be war. It's supposed to be dangerous and serious. So, and that's kind of what Catelyn's attitude is throughout the whole chapter, kind of like she's just baffled at the attitude of these people. And it's frustrating for her. Now, here's another quote that explains, that kind of gets us somewhere else here in terms of all these distractions and silliness that's happening. Quote,
"The height of folly was reached when a plump fool came capering out in gold-painted tin with a cloth lion's head and chased a dwarf around the tables, whacking him over the head with a bladder. Finally, King Renly demanded to know why he was beating his brother. 'Why, your grace, I'm the kinslayer,' the fool said.
'It's Kingslayer, fool of a fool,' Renly said, and the hall rang with laughter." This is a quote that I'm not really sure what to make. I would love to hear y'all's takes on it. To me, it might indicate that we have Jaime versus Tyrion coming up much later, which, well, that does happen on TV. And if Tyrion's going to be hand to Daenerys and Jaime is going to be leading a lot of the Lannister armies, both those things make a lot of sense. Both the things are reasonable expectations from the books. And what we saw on TV is Tyrion being out-generaled by Jaime. And, well, maybe that will happen in the books. I'm not super confident in that, but I don't really have a great take on what this theory on this quote and what it portends. So we'll be looking out for y'all's takes as we move through the rest of our notes on this chapter. But, yeah, that's one that gets me. Usually I have an answer, but that one, I don't really have a strong one. So we're talking a lot about the size of Renly's army and how young it is and how unexperienced it is. Not just the youth, but their greenness, Knights of Summer, etc. Compared to, say, a lot of the Northerners or some of the other armies who seemingly have more veterans in them. Joe Buckley wonders if the Reach just didn't have much of a role in the Greyjoy Rebellion. And indeed, that is specifically mentioned here, quote,
"Few of the others were..." Oh, no, that is not it.
That is it.
Oh, okay, good. "Few of the others were very much older. They had been babes during the sack of King's Landing, and no more than boys when Balon Greyjoy raised the Iron Islands in rebellion."
So that's a partial explanation. A lot of them just weren't old enough to be there. A few of them were. But where were the ones who were of age, and where are they now? Well, frankly, this is why Renly is such a great parallel to Daemon Blackfyre, or vice versa, depending on how you look at it. Daemon Blackfyre was a king by acclaim. Well, he never really was king. He was acclaimed king. He never sat the Iron Throne. And the people who followed him were mostly second sons, knights, people who were big on chivalry, people inspired by him. And that's not as many of the conservatives, not as many of the older, more experienced folks who had been through war, who kind of had more appreciation for Daeron the Good's rule and realized that it's better to have a cautious, patient ruler than it is to have some warrior king. Ahem, Robert. So this is a very strong connection there, and I think that's part of the explanation here, is that Renly has amassed a popular following, but a lot of them are these same types. Second sons, Knights of Summer, as we say, people who aren't set to inherit, and of course a lot of people just swept up in the excitement in those same regions, the Stormlands and the Reach in particular. And that's even brought up here, one of these particular examples. Catelyn asks Robar why he's here, Robar Royce. And he says, well, I'm a second son, and, you got to go. Second sons have to go out and make their way in the world. And so he ends up in Renly's Rainbow Guard. Of course. Why not? We won't see a whole lot of the Reach the rest of the series, as far as we know, though there's a good chance we start to see more of it in the latter books. So what I mean is that we don't see hardly any of it over the next few books, and we'll see it probably when we get to see some action in Highgarden, which George says we will eventually see.
Yeah, we're gonna see Willis and Garland, a bit more of them.
Yeah, there's still the taking back of the Shield Islands, which we probably won't see in person, but we may hear about it and we might see some of it. And there's also the taking of Brightwater Keep. There's lots of things happening. Of course, Old Town is part of the Reach, so that's the one exception to seeing the Reach, but it's not really the Reach proper. It's just this one little, well, it's not little, but it's the Reach is so large. Old Town doesn't really represent what's happening elsewhere. So anyway, we will certainly see more of that. So Robb is making a lot more effort to make connections than the other kings at this time. Tywin and Tyrion are going to start doing more of that. And of course, he sent Theon off. He sent Catelyn now south. He's also messaged Lysa that Lysa's not going to respond positively, but he's still, trying. He's still shrewd enough to know his sending of Cleos will not produce any results, though. So he knows that it's just kind of a delaying tactic, and he knows that it's just part of this song and dance. So in part of the food porn and reinforcing how powerful Highgarden is here, we have a little add-on, which is the presence of Wendell Manderly. And here's a quote.
He was one of the fattest men Catelyn had ever known. But however much he loved his food, he loved his honor more.
And then immediately after, we have this quote or immediately associated, right? I don't know if it's immediately after, but associated.
It's like a paragraph after.
Paragraph after. Okay, you checked. Good. I'm glad you checked.
Robb had sent 20 of his best to see her safely to Renly. He had sent 5 lordlings as well, whose names in high birth would add weight and honor to her mission.
So the large man who loved his honor more. There you go. Weight and honor. That's sneaky. I definitely had not caught that before. Joe Buckley with a great take here. He points out that Sir Wendell is a great example of how Renly of showing that Renly's tactics are working, because they show up and he's excited that they're having a tournament. Catelyn's like, "What the hell are they doing having a tournament? This is war, y'all." But Wendell's like, "Yeah, this is awesome." So there you go. It shows that even though Renly's strategy from our perspective might be like, this is kind of awkward, it doesn't mean it's not working. Arguably, it would have been better for him to just make a beeline straight for King's Landing and just grab it. That might have worked better. But there are some merits to this plan as well, showing his power, showing that he's not in any rush, just acting confident, which Renly is very good at doing. And I mean acting confident. Or maybe it's not an act. Renly is confident. I don't think we have to call it an act. I think Renly is genuinely confident, and that is part of the draw. People like Renly. It's not hard to see why people like him. The political situation, when you dig into it, it's like, yeah, you can start to see why he's a bad guy for trying to usurp the throne. But at the same time, it's not hard to see why he's popular. Here's another quote where Catelyn is basically realizing the same thing.
Small wonder the lords gather around him with such fervor, she thought. He is Robert come again. Renly was handsome as Robert had been handsome, long of limb and broad of shoulder, with the same coal-black hair, fine and straight, the same deep blue eyes, the same easy smile. The slender circlet around his brows seemed to suit him well. It was soft gold, a ring of roses exquisitely wrought. At the front lifted a stag's head of dark green jade, adorned with golden eyes and golden antlers.
That is quite fancy, isn't it? He's a fancy man, fancy, handsome man.
Yeah, he knows how to dress like a king.
Yeah, he does. He does all the walking. He walks the walk and talks the talk very well. But beyond that, I'm not so sure.
But it's also a good reminder because Renly in the show does not fit this description.
Good point. Yeah, you're right.
He doesn't have this powerful look to him.
No, he doesn't. He looks pretty ordinary.
And because it was the show, you see behind the curtain with him and Loras, and so you see his vulnerabilities as well, I will say.
That's true. You don't see... you. That's a very good point. The show also, at this point in the books, almost no one would know of his sexual preferences, for example. That's the only far more explicit.
One of the main hints we've had at this point is Stannis.
Yeah, is saying, and even that's not really mentioned yet. His joke about in your bed, he's like to stay a maid, or she's like to stay a maid, comes next week, but we do get him saying, "Laura, stay and pray with me." I've quite forgotten the words. That is in this chapter, if I remember right.
Yeah, so in retrospect.
So there are some clues, but this is only the beginning of these clues. It's not made explicit till later.
Which also comes into play with, obviously, your Daemon Blackfire point.
Yeah, very true. So Catelyn immediately notes that Renly's charisma is really important and that his looks are also really important, but he takes Dorne for granted. That's not something Catelyn thinks about, but it's something that Tyrion thinks about later, and it proves accurate. Tyrion realizes that's a weakness in Renly's strategy and exploits it quite well. But it's also worth noting that Renly has won over a large section of Westeros that was previously for the Targaryens. If you look at the cross-section of his following, a lot of them were for the Targaryens during Robert's Rebellion, which is interesting since you would think that the people following Robert's brother wouldn't necessarily have that alliance or that allegiance, but they do. And that is, of course, part of why Renly takes Dorne for granted, because he kind of expects them to follow along because of how much they hate the Lannisters, particularly Tywin. So it's not the worst assumption on Renly's part, but he probably should have done more to make sure of it. He would not have had to offer as much as Tyrion did, although, to be fair, he didn't have anyone to marry to them, which so the Lannisters have that edge in that they have a Myrcella to send to Dorne, whereas Renly has no children. Speaking of no children, that had to be on Marjorie and her family's list, very high up on the list, given that marriage. Bringing the Tyrells into his alliance was a huge thing, and as we know, he was trying to marry Marjorie to Robert, something we'll talk about a little more later. So Brienne comes up with this line that sounds a lot like something Sansa would say, although not Sansa current. Sansa already would disagree with her past self on this line, quote,
"What?
Winter comes for all of us,"
Oh.
Catelyn thought.
Winter comes for all of us. Catelyn thought. You said it, so that's it.
Winter comes for all of us twice, Catelyn thought.
I thought you were telling me to read the Brienne always sunny, always summer quote. Here's a late night stream for you.
Of course, there is also some serious Lady Stoneheart foreshadowing in this one. It's a big one.
Yeah, this is great. The steel was polished to such a high sheen that she could see her reflection in the breastplate, gazing back at her as if from the bottom of a deep green pond. The face of a drowned woman, Catelyn thought. Can you drown in grief?
Yikes. That is something. Wow. And it's, so I don't even need to explain that one. I mean, drowned, being in the water, the river, dying, all that. And her reaction to Brienne is part of it fits into this whole picture of Lady Stoneheart foreshadowing. Ooh, here's another one. Quote,
"Is there any creature on earth as unfortunate as an ugly woman?"
Well,
yeah, you.
Yeah, this is a much uglier woman, is, I guess, by that logic.
Yeah.
I mean,
she becomes a very, very ugly woman.
A supernaturally ugly.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate.
Impossibly. Yes. Very unfortunate. It's pretty, putting it mildly, for the Red Wedding.
The unfortunate wedding.
Yeah, it's not the Red Wedding. It's the unfortunate wedding. And, along with Brienne's sentiment that winter comes or Catelyn's sentiment that winter comes for us all, paired with Brienne saying that it's always summer in the songs, well, it's related to Ned, because Catelyn thinks that winter has come for her already because Ned is gone. And that's just even more tragic because she has yet to face some of the worst things that are coming. Not to make light of losing her husband, but damn, it's not going to get better. And Sandor, of course, has been acting so knightly in King's Landing towards Sansa, as much as he can, given what the tough spot they're both in. Yet again, he's nothing like a knight. And so paired up here, we have Brienne, who can't be a knight because of her gender, according to Westerosi rules, apparently. Maybe the books will also break that mold like the show did. Maybe. We'll see. That'd be kind of cool. I would like them to do that. I don't know that we can guess that it will, but it would be nice. And knighthood is such a strong theme just throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, but really early, really much in this chapter. Bran thinks about it a lot. It's just a big deal. Nina has a good question here. She wonders if the idea of Brienne and Dunk being related was something George had already come up with here. Now, remember that The Hedge Knight was written really close to A Clash of Kings. So I think he probably had that in mind. They have the large size in common already, and the style of fighting, the parallel fighting there. But that's the second Hedge Knight book where the fighting style with the Lucas and Loras is paired up. So that might have been something he decided on later. And the size argument maybe isn't the best, because if you're going to have, this trope-breaking large female fighter type, well, it makes sense to have her be large. She could be a great small fighter, but you've already got that with Arya. If you want her to be slugging it out with the big knight, she's got to be big too. And, if he really wants to go take the idea even farther, he makes her even bigger. So by that itself doesn't indicate she's related to Dunk and maybe other characters, but it's a pretty strong indication.
But you also have, her introduction being this tourney, and Dunk's, major plot line in the first book being this tourney, along with the certain houses that we see.
Yeah, for
all
example,
these Reach houses. Yeah. As well, Catelyn spied the fox and flowers of House Florent, Fossaway apples red and green, Lord Tarley's striding huntsman, oak leaves for Oakheart, cranes for Crane, a cloud of black and orange butterflies for the Mullendores. Across the Mander, the Stormlords had raised their standards, Renly's own bannermen, sworn to House Baratheon in Storm's End. Catelyn recognized Bryce Caron's nightingales, the Penrose quills, and Lord Estermont's sea turtle, green on green.
A lot of these characters, or these houses, not these characters, these houses appear in The Hedge Knight, the first novel.
Yeah, obviously, most notably, the Fossaway red and green apples,
right.
In which case we see them as very, very major characters.
Yeah, we see the formation of the Green Apple Fossaway.
So I think this is a giveaway for me, the idea that they're mentioned here, red and green, in the Hedge Knight. He's written it that whether it's Brienne before Dunk or Dunk before Brienne, I think that the fact that they were so close.
I agree with that. A Tree Girl from Flick with a great catch, pointing out that Brienne being in love with Renly is kind of like John the Fiddler having a crush on Dunk, but in reverse. Now, of course, Brienne's crush on Renly is a lot deeper than John the Fiddler's just lust for Dunk, but still, it is a good parallel. I think that was intentional by George, having a little fun with these parallels.
Yeah, everyone lusts for Dunk the Hunk.
Dunk the Hunk, yeah. He's not Dunk the Lunk, he's Dunk the Hunk, that's right.
Thick as a trunk.
Yep, he wants to try his lance out. A couple of random thoughts and questions from y'all. Super chat from Strange TV says, amazing stuff. Keep it up, you too. Thanks for all the content. Well, thank you for saying so. We appreciate it. Patron Paul Berry says, this Catelyn chapter is my personal peak frustration with the Starks and their inflexible honor. Yeah, I agree with Paul here on this point. He suggests that Catelyn thinks, had you stayed and lent your support to Ned, he might still be alive. Basically blaming Renly for Ned's death. And only moments earlier, Renly had told her he'd offered exactly that. And Paul says, people give the Starks points for sticking to their principles, but really it's that they can't compromise, not even slightly. I think this is a show-only line, but the Hound gets it right on the money. How many Starks they got to behead before you figure it out? I think it's a fair point. There are good reasons to stick to your principles, of course, but also, you can't just stick to them. Like, you can't just be like Stannis and break before you bend. You have to be willing to compromise sometimes, for not just for expediency's sake, but to save lives sometimes. Principles aren't worth more than lives, usually. Sometimes they are, I suppose. That's a matter of debate. But in any case, the point is that she's kind of being a hypocrite with what she guessed Ned would do versus what she expected from Renly. I think it's a fair point. There's also some reverse foreshadowing here. A very familiar tactic from George R. Martin. Quote,
King Renly smiled. If I'm not safe in the heart of Lord Caswell's castle, with my own host around me, one sword will make no matter. Not even your sword, Brienne. Sit and eat. If I have need of you, I'll send for you.
Yeah, I mean, she was powerless to stop a shadow baby. Her sword never left its scabbard. I mean, there was nothing to swing it at, and she couldn't have reacted quick enough anyway. And just the same, he was surrounded by his huge host. Didn't matter. Archmaester Renny from Flick points out a nice quote that Renly she sees Renly as a ghost in a golden crown, which she thinks of it that way. It's very clever. It's a double meaning because she thinks of how much he looks like Robert, and that's why she's thinking of him as a ghost. But it also serves as foreshadowing for the fact that he's about to die, not in the next Catelyn chapter, but in Catelyn 4. Treagle also points out that it's not just the food and all the power and Renly's confidence, but like we pointed out, Ashea noted that he knows how to look like a king. His wealth is really adding to the impact of his charisma. It's kind of like what Tywin likes to do. Tywin shows off the wealth and power of Cashley Rock. Well, Highgarden, not quite as rich as Cashley Rock, but they can really make noise with their wealth too. Stefan B had a great catch here. This is another one from Flick. Flick really came in strong with the commentary on Catelyn 2 here. He points out the archer sits there complaining. There's just a random archer who complains about Brienne's dirty trick against Loras. But hey, Loras used a trick on Gregor in the tournament for Ned's becoming hand. So, very good catch there. So Loras can't complain himself there. He would be a hypocrite. And he doesn't, to be fair. In Arya 7, which is 8 chapters from now, she hears that disgusting anecdote from Chiswick, which occurs right after Loras' trick. And the Mountain was in an extra bad mood. So here's another little quote that gives us another example of George referring to fighting like dancing. Quote.
The white horse and the black one wheeled like lovers at a harvest dance, the riders throwing steel in place of kisses.
Yes, more dancing. Now, Tyrion has Shagga, Jon has Ed, Theon is sort of his own comic relief. Dany's going to get strong Belwas at the end of this book. And Cat has good old Captain Obvious, one of our favorite supporting characters. Quote.
Attorney, Hal Mullen declared. He had a penchant for loudly announcing the obvious.
And we'll get more Captain Obvious lines in the next couple of Catelyn chapters before they finally part company later at River Run, when he sends her, or when she sends him, rather, with Ned's bones back to Winterfell. George R. R. Martin doesn't get into too much detail with Bitterbridge itself, even though this is the location, something he normally does. But that's fair play here. There's so many other introductions to give, and frankly, the castle is underwhelming. There's not much to say about it, but we will say something about it anyway. It's in a very strategic location. It's much more important than the castle itself is its location. It's where the Mander meets the Rose Road. The Mander is an extremely important river, and the Rose Road is an extremely important route. So it's sort of like the inn of the crossroads of the Reach, in a sense. It's the closest parallel we have. So kind of a crossroads where there should be lots of traffic, should be boats, lots of foot traffic, lots of wagons, lots of trade, things like that. It used to be called Stonebridge. It was renamed after the battle at Stonebridge, where a fearsome warrior named Wat the Hewer, who was a huge man wielding an axe, led 9,000 poor fellows. Remember, those are the commoners who joined the faith as warriors before they were banned by Maegor the Cruel, who is the man they were arrayed against in battle. The battle actually occurred when they were trying to cross, and it went very badly for the poor fellows. They were surrounded and divided and slaughtered. It was so bad that the river was said to run red, and thus the name Bitterbridge was born. In what is one of many Maegor the Cruel to Gregor the Clegane parallels, Wat the Hewer was captured alive, dismembered, but left alive. That should remind us of what the Mountain did to Vargo Hoat, cutting off his arms and legs and carrying him around, making him watch things. And hey, Arya 6 is only 4 chapters away, and it's the first extended stream time for the Gregor Clegane himself. Apart from the tourney, he's mostly just talked about a lot. So we have seen him, but this is where we actually have extended screen time from him. And it's all coming together so well, just like the Mander and the Rose Road at Bitterbridge. One last tidbit from this chapter, that there is a little quote here that I'll have Ashea read for y'all.
Lord Willem's sons, Joshua and Elias, disputed heatedly about who would be first over the walls of King's Landing.
So this is just it seems like just a casual comment about the Knights of Summer, talking about who's going to do what and what glory awaits them all and things like that. There's several moments like this that Catelyn notices, but this one is a nod to Austen Ard, meaning the Tad Williams novels, a.k.a. The Dragonbone Chair, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. A dispute between Joshua and Elias is key to the main series in those books, And the author, Tad Williams, is probably why this is Lord Willem's sons. So there are many references to Tad Williams and the Austin Ard series, but I think this is the first one we've run into. But like I said, there will be more. Okay, Jon 3, the one where there aren't any boys, aka the gang meets Craster and Gilly. It's also Jon's longest chapter of the book by far, as it involves, well, the same thing we said at the beginning of this episode. Very important setup, but in particular, in this case, for Jon's arc, it's the others and the wildlings and things long forgotten. It starts like this, quote,
"A blowing rain lashed at Jon's face as he spurred his horse across the swollen stream.
The bleak start of this chapter only gets worse as bad weather really pales in comparison to, child sacrifice and forced incest and all that. And in rereading this chapter, there are a lot of seeming contradictions. And I don't mean like mistakes by George R. R. Martin. I mean things like Craster acting devout with regard to the others, and in things like guest right. But also incest and kinslaying are abominations to Northern cultures, from what we're told, and he seems to have embraced those, let alone seeing them as wrong. So it's very interesting. And more than that, with later tales from White Harbor and Davos' A Dance with Dragons chapters, and from some of the history books, The World of Ice and Fire in particular, but also Fire and Blood, things make this Craster scene look quite a bit differently. It just, instead of Craster, well, he's not rehabilitated by these revelations by any means, but he seems like less of an exception. Sorta. Maybe, right? He seems like more of a relic, a representative of faded beliefs made more certain by recent events, though, right? Because the others are coming back, seemingly. So maybe he's becoming more right in his mind. In this chapter, his beliefs are loudly stated, and given his age, because he's not a young man, and how long he's lived in this area, it's hard to argue with him. Not that I think he's justified in giving up his babies. No, of course not. But as G.R. Mormont tells Jon, but the wildlings serve crueler gods than you or I. So when I say it's hard to argue with him, I mean that literally he's not going to listen. He's very confident in his beliefs. He's not going to hear other people's interpretations. He doesn't care. He's doing his thing. He's an old man. He's not changing his ways. The alternative is brought up. Mormont says, Jon, do you think I should kill him? But killing a man who would save so many rangers from death to exposure is a major complication. You can't easily just do that, right? It's tough. And of course, so many of the rangers have accepted this. So all that is about the others, meaning Craster's attitude. I'm not referring to the incest when I talk about his attitudes. That's just not normal. We don't see that elsewhere in the North or with the wildlings, not much anyway. And it serves as a device to make Craster seem even more abnormal and abhorrent. But I think that's partly masking some of the other abhorrent things he does, which are kind of normal-ish, meaning the human sacrifice. Human sacrifice in the North is something that happened for thousands of years and perhaps only ended mere centuries ago. It doesn't make the sacrifices less chilling or wrong. It just, like I said, makes Craster seem less different by comparison. But this is where one of these, not a contradiction, but where there's a bit of a difference that's meaningful and significant, though it's still human sacrifice. And the difference I mean is, well, Craster gives his sons to the cold, whereas the style of human sacrifice we seem to hear about that's gone on for so long in the North is sacrifice to the werewoods. And it's blood sacrifice, from what we hear of like entrails being hung, and we see Bran's vision of the captive having his throat slit. That's different than what Craster is doing. Another difference we see is that Craster gives sheep to the others when he has no sons. And it's peculiar. We don't have a lot else to go on here as far as examples. We do see sheep's bones at White Tree, and again, Craster's mother came from there. But this is still a very compelling but unrevealed mystery. We don't know if Craster learned that from her, and if he did, well, why does he do it differently? Did Craster's mother, well, she didn't leave him out to the others, so we're not quite sure where he got started with this idea. So this is where we need to consider the show, and that it's quite possible the baby becomes an other via the Night King's touch scene is misleading. Be clear, I'm not against the idea that these babies become others. I just think we shouldn't assume it because, well, on one hand,
I want to quote you on that. You are pro babies being turned into others.
There's pro-life, pro-choice, and pro-other babies. Yeah, pro-undead. Oh, pro-undeath? I don't know. To be clear, I'm not against the idea that these babies can become others. Of course, the others don't breed, so they probably have some way to make more of them, and maybe this is it. But the sheep part is a little confounding, because, well, how is a sheep a substitute for a child if the point of the children is to turn them into others? Are we going to see, blue-eyed other sheep as part of their army later? I just don't think so. So why are they accepting a sheep instead of a child, given they can't be used for the same purposes? Is it like, all right, we'll take that sheep for now, but we need some babies eventually? And Gilly points out that that Craster's eventually going to start giving dogs now that he's out of sheep. So it's a little confusing. We just don't have similar examples for that. We have human sacrifice in the past as to the werewoods, and we see the sheep sacrificed maybe in some other at a White Tree along with bones that are not sheep. So yeah, these things do add up, but they don't add up to a conclusion. Or rather, they do connect, but they don't connect in any way that we can be sure. So this is all stuff we're going to have to keep in mind for when we get more information about the others much, much later. Because as we know, even with 3 books more coming after Clash of Kings, we still don't get that much more on them. We don't even see them that much more. But we do get a little. But Gilly says, Gilly is a big part of our window here, because Craster is not forthcoming. In fact, he lies. But Gilly, she tells us some truth. Here's a quote.
He gives the boys to the gods. Come the white cold he does, and of late it comes more often. That's why he started giving them sheep, even though he has a taste for mutton. Only now, the sheep's gone too. Next, it will be the dogs, till... She lowered her eyes and stroked her belly.
So, till her child, which she worries will be a boy, and indeed, well, we see later, it is. So, she was right to worry. I mean, well, of course she was right to worry, but now, despite the Watch tolerating Craster because of the life-death nature of ranging beyond the wall, Jon makes it clear from a moral point of view that this is wrong. He wants no part of it. Jon, again, is like our moral compass on a lot of issues, and that's partly because he's raised by Ned Stark. He's a bit surprised to learn Benjen accepted it, though. That kind of strikes him as difficult to consider. But if we're being blunt about circumstances, if Jon were in danger of freezing to death, he might change his tune and say, okay, well, I'm not going to hold to my principles so tightly that I die. Living to uphold your principles throughout the rest of your life seems like a better plan. But Jon isn't faced with that decision. And he also just won't help Gilly. He won't break his vows. He's like Ned in this. He's very duty-bound, even though he has compassion. Duty seems to come first most of the time. And while Sam begins to teach him why there's more to this than vows, that wildlings are people too, that lesson's not going to fully sink in with Jon until not that much long later when he meets Ygritte and forms a relationship with her. So Jon and Sam are the main two that form relationships with wildlings, and that leads to helping bring them in alignment with the rest of humanity so they can fight against this evil that Craster and by extension his wives have been forced into. So there are other ways of dealing with this rather than Craster's way. Jon's also a lot like Arya here. We have a POV amidst horrors that seemingly everyone just accepts. Arya can't believe the Hound got away with killing Micah and was so mad that her father just went along with it. She did not see him step up like she expected he was going to. He just had to blow with the wind like so many others. He hated doing it, but he didn't really have a whole lot of choice. So they're both getting lessons in what the real world is like versus what they've been told it's like. This is the start of Jon's vows slipping and his sense of duty evolving to include people he's been told to exclude. It's like, well, yeah, you got to form your own rules for this. You got to go with your heart sometimes, and this duty thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. Even though there's a lot of honor in serving, well, these things conflict. It's the same kind of thing that Jaime explains to Brienne later, and it's a great point that swearing vows can conflict, and like Aemon says, love and duty do not match up so well. They don't go together well. So it's easy to see the world in black and white when no one tells you about the gray. And that's what a lot of Jon's upbringing was. His upbringing was not very gray. And that color symbolism exists here too. The Night's Watch are all in black, and they're arrayed against this endless white. But so in that sense, the good guys and the bad guys are pretty clear. But when you get into the human element, it's not as clear. And that's when you get into things like guest right, which doesn't really relate to the concept of the others so much, but it's still huge in this chapter. And this is the first time it's particularly well explained. Before it's alluded to, Nina reminds us that Robb greeting Tyrion with the blade on his lap is, a sign of guest right. It's kind of, as we can intuit without explanation what's going on there. And Tyrion makes it clear too. But in this chapter, we start to get the finer points of how guest right works. At least some of them, not all of it. And that, of course, is groundwork for the Red Wedding and other things. Gilly is a huge part of this. She shows herself to be very observant when Jon says, I can't violate guest right. But Gilly says, technically, you didn't accept guest right. And she's correct. So she's technically correct, which, say it with me, everybody, the best kind of correct. Yes. Thank you, Futurama, for that enduring lesson.
One of the quotes we use most often.
Though Gior teaches Jon a lot, and he's overall a decent guy, there's some fair criticisms of him to level on a number of areas. He's not as thoughtful as Jon as a leader, and he doesn't have either their moral centering as a, and he's also not a POV, so we don't know what he's thinking. So that maybe, to be fair, there would be more nuance to his decisions. But he says this, quote,
"The wide world is full of people wanting help, Jon. Would that some could find the courage to help themselves. Craster sprawls in his loft even now, stinking of wine and lost to sense. On his board below lies a sharp new axe. Were it me, I'd name it Answered Prayer and make an end."
Joe Buckley says this is a nomination for one of the most disappointing lines in the whole book. Yeah, he says a reread of Game of Thrones has already changed his view of Gior, but he's knocked himself down another level here. This is not really a thoughtful line of thinking from Gior. I have to agree with Joe on that. Okay, so imagine that they do that. Imagine that they do kill Craster. So many issues with that. For one thing, he is their source of food and sort of protection, in a sense. But where are they going to go after that? Are they just going to stay there? I mean, that's not going to go well for them. And what about the fact that most of them, if not nearly all of them, are technically his daughters, meaning that only a few of them could do that without it being kinslaying? Ugh. So, yeah.
Considering that how old he is, I don't know. I think they all have to be related to him.
Maybe like one or two of the oldest ones aren't, but you're right.
I guess maybe he could have. It just seems like is he capturing another woman and he couldn't know in soul of what trading? Like, you have one of these women and I'm going to take one of yours. Yeah, you wonder where they originally came from. It's not really explored. I mean, Gilly was definitely his daughter, so she came from there. But yeah, we don't really get an explanation. And this moment is done with a flair for symbolism too. It's literally Mormont's axe that he's saying they should use. He's like, I gave them my axe. They can do it. He's willing to give the axe. He's willing to see it used to kill Craster. He fully acknowledges that Craster is terrible, but he won't do it himself. Everything but the responsibility. So Joe makes another observation here. Quote, "The cold gods," she said, "the ones in the night, the white shadows." Yeah,
he says, I don't think they're ever called this again. I checked, they're not. No one else ever calls them the cold gods. So, but it's meant to be very distinct. It's showing us that these are the gods that when Mormont says the wildlings serve crueler gods than us, well, it's kind of hinted at this is what he's talking about, even though he doesn't fully understand what he's saying. He doesn't fully understand the meaning of these sacrifices and who they're being given to. Because really, still at this point, Gior, he's aware that something's up. He saw The Walking Dead, but he's still mostly focused on the wildlings with this mission.
Is he caught up on The Walking Dead?
That's a lot of seasons to watch. And all those spin-offs and everything, yeah. He really should watch that. His Night's Watch should all train by watching The Walking Dead. Should be required watching for all of them. So we wonder, because Craster definitely seems to tell the truth about Mance. Well, he definitely tells the truth about Mance. We see that later. But what about Benjen? He says he never saw Benjen. Is that true? Craster admits that Waymar was there. And since Benjen was going to follow Waymar, then wouldn't Benjen have shown up there? Maybe not, because maybe he didn't make it that far. Then again, a theory that Benjen is the one who left behind the cache of weapons, the dragonglass weapons that Jon finds not long from now. Well, that's north of Craster's Keep. So if Benjen left that, then he would have had to pass Craster's Keep. So it's hard to see why Craster would lie about this, but it can't be ruled out. It's definitely possible. One of the things he does lie about is that he says he's never seen the others. So the reason this is probably a lie is that, well, maybe he only leaves his sacrifices but never sees them physically, but that's a semantic dodge if it's not a lie. But I do think it's a lie because Gilly says the following. What color are their eyes? He asked her.
Blue, as bright as blue stars and as cold.
She has seen them, he thought. Craster lied. So Jon agrees that Craster was lying. So do I.
Real quick?
Yeah.
I just have to point out, everyone on screen can tell that everyone who's watching can see the lighting on Aziz changed right before I had to read that quote. We have a Philips Hue and it's set to turn to rainbow at 12:30. So that's just a funny little thing.
It should have turned rainbow. We were talking about the Rainbow Guard. It's a little late. Oh, well. Quote, a comment from Flick Leaf, aka Mother of Tribbles, says, someone on YouTube, I would credit them if I knew, she couldn't remember, suggests that maybe Craster lied about knowing where Waymar was going and, in fact, informed the others about him, which is interesting because whether or not that's true, it touches on a long-debated theory. And when I say long, I mean since this book dropped. So people have been wondering since 1998 or so, how does Craster communicate with the others? What's the mechanism? Again, he didn't learn leaving boys out in the cold from his mother, probably because he wasn't left out in the cold. Again, I'll repeat myself by saying that to be clear. Did he learn it from someone else, or does he actually talk to them somehow? And another issue with him learning it from his mother or from anyone else is the recency of the others' return. Gilly says the cold gods have been coming more and more often. So it's not necessarily true that anyone else was part of bringing the others back, or if they came back on their own. So we have a lot of things to balance here. Did Craster help the others return, or is he helping them regain their strength after as part of their return? Or is it something else entirely? So there's differences in these forms of sacrifice, and I think that's really key, and it shows us that something has changed, and that something that's changed might be the return of the others, and someone like Craster is adapting to this horrible reality. But still, it leaves that question that Mother of Tribbles raises here. How is he talking to them? How is he dealing with them? Where did this arrangement come from? I don't have an answer. But Tywin says a few things that relate to this, that you can see how these things said about him are kind of telephone game versions of the truth. This is a great catch by Stefan B., also from Flick, Flick is really killing it for this chapter. I already said that. I'm saying it again. Here's a quote.
Tywin said Craster was a kinslayer, liar, raper, and craven, and hinted that he trafficked with slavers and demons.
And worse, the old forester would add, clacking his wooden teeth. There's a cold smell to that one, there is. Listen to Tywin. Tywin's going to talk about the cold smell once they're at the Fist of the First Men, too. And people are going to argue with him that you can't smell the cold. And Jon is like, no, Tywin's right. You can smell the cold. I smelled it when I fought those whites. But what's this about slavers and giving, is that just a hint with giving up his kids? Is that what the rumor turned into? Giving up his kids is like people thought he was selling them to slavers rather than giving them to the others. They may have, but the demons part might be trafficking with the others. That may be where that comment comes from. The raper part, well, you can see that he's taking his wives this way. The liar part we already saw. The kinslayer part, giving up your kids is kinslaying. Craven, he might not be a craven. I haven't seen him be a craven, but arguably, his lifestyle is cravenly.
Yeah, if he's giving up children to the others,
that's a fair point. Yeah, he doesn't act cowardly openly, but his actions do. His actions indicate it.
Situation.
I'm sorry.
Most people would be a craven.
Yeah, they may not sacrifice their kids, but they wouldn't be able to stand up to the others, and that's a fair point. Like how, maybe there's other options, like running south, which he's too proud to do that. But yeah, it's fair to say he doesn't exactly have a lot of options. On the other hand, if we're talking about trusting Tywin, we always say these things can't be taken too far. Old Nan, I think, speaks mostly truth, but it's not every single word that comes from her mouth is accurate, I think. Like, for example, here, Tywin, though I think he's right, he also says he slept with 3 of Craster's wives in this chapter, and that's almost certainly not true. There's other elements that point to Craster's bargain with the others without explicitly explaining it. For example, Nina points to his extremely weak defenses that Jon takes note of. He's like, yeah, he doesn't really seem to have bothered with much in the way of defenses here. He's confident in his bargain, I suppose. Gilly remarks that the king is supposed to keep the people safe. Even above the wall, we can't escape that that's a big theme of this book. People fighting over who has the right to be king. And they do this in a variety of ways, with force and with proclaiming themselves the most capable of handling things like keeping people safe and dealing out justice, which there is very little of north of the wall. This chapter ends with Jon thinking on the futility of this mission. Gior wants to know what's happening, and I think he's not wrong to emphasize the value of intelligence to showing to needing to know what's going on beyond the wall. I don't agree with people who say that he should have just sat back and defended the wall. I think that wouldn't have worked, and I know why, and we know it wouldn't have worked, because the Magnar of Then's mission to climb the wall and attack Castle Black on the south side only failed because of Jon's warning. And if there hadn't been rangers out exploring, they would not have seen that coming. So Castle Black would have been caught unawares because they didn't have the ability to see Mance Rayder coming, and they didn't have the ability to defend 300 miles of wall. And there's only, as we see, yeah, it's a tiny group of rangers. There's 300 of them. What, 1 ranger per mile of wall? I mean, it would be very easy for Mance to find a place along the wall that the Watch can't keep an eye on and send men over it. That's exactly what the Magnar of Then's mission was. So I think that, yeah, it's fair to say that this mission is really risky and dangerous, and there's things he could have done differently, but not going north has a lot of perils too. Maybe he should have just continued to send out ranging parties, just larger ones, rather than just sending everyone out at once. But I just want to point out that none of Gior's options here were good. An aspect of all this that Gior is misled by too, and understandably so, is the timing of everything. Again, I want to point you to the fact that he's mostly focused on Mance Rayder and the Wildlings, and is just kind of the others and the Walking Dead are in the back of his head, because he's not sure what's going on with that. He doesn't have much information. And of course, they're also looking for Benjen. That's another big part of this mission. He doesn't consider the timing of all these rangers like Garrett running off. We do. We know Garrett is mentioned in this chapter by Craster, so we can have a chance as readers to make this connection, but it's still pretty subtle. Point being, he does consider not only how weak the Watch is, but how weak the North is, because he's aware, meaning Gior is aware, that Robb has taken so much of the North's strength south to fight the War of the Five Kings. So he says Mance couldn't hope for better timing in planning an invasion. But he hasn't considered that the things he sees with Garrett's example and the other rangers that ran off is that those are connected. Mance is massing an army for the same reason Garrett ran away, meaning the same reason Craster is sacrificing his sons. Not that Craster intends to flee south of the wall, but Mance's true purpose is to do that. He's not planning an invasion per se. That's a last resort. He wants to escape the others and lead his people away from the others. If he has to conquer south to do that, so be it, because they're dead if they don't. It may be a doomed campaign attacking south, but it's definitely a doomed campaign to stay north. So, like Gior, they're caught between the winter and the wall. And these realizations are what leads Stannis and Jon to both accept the concept of an alliance with the Wildlings versus the dead. They realize what Mance already realized, that this is their only choice. Gior never gets a chance to piece all that together. He's going to die before that all becomes clear. However, his offer to Craster to raise his kids with the Watch is sort of a precursor to Jon and Stannis bringing the entire Wildling population over the wall. All right, some questions and miscellaneous thoughts. Newt Rock 44 says, so you feel the others are just using Craster and wouldn't roll over on him? I mean, I understand the line of thinking, but does that not suggest they don't want to kill all the warm-blooded life? I think that it's kind of like they're using him while they can, and they will eventually roll him over after they're done using him. I think he's just a tool that is helping them, but once they don't need him anymore, they won't give a crap about him. There's some similar examples. Nina brings up a great point comparing him to Sour Billy Tipton in Fever Dream. If you've read Fever Dream, well, you may get this point. If not, I highly recommend checking out our Facebook group and her thoughts on this. Can't get too deep into it because a lot of you haven't read Fever Dream. But the point is, Sour Billy Tipton is a human, and the book is about vampires, or it's a vampire story set on the Mississippi River. And so a common theme with vampire stories is that they use humans to do the things that they can't do, like do things during the day, bring them fresh blood, bring them kills, things like that. So that's the parallel that Nina dives into, and I think it's pretty good. It's a pretty strong, solid parallel comparing the others who seem to maybe need help. They can't operate during the day. There's some strong parallels there. So maybe Craster is a bit like that classic vampire human trope, like a Renfield, or like Mina says, Sour Billy Tipton. Here's a funny quote, sort of.
Be careful around Craster's women. As if Samwell Tarly needed warning on that score.
Well, maybe.
Yeah, he's the only one out of the whole group that scored.
Yeah.
That actually
On
scored.
That score. Yeah, very nice. Tywin's probably lying, but Sam does indeed eventually score. Interesting, too, that Craster notes that Jon looks like a Stark. Like, he's like, you look like a Stark. That's very distinct. That Starks have a look that even someone like Craster can recognize. I think that's pretty neat. Here's another telling quote line here.
The Night's Watch has other wars to fight.
Jon thinks other wars in his mind. So, yeah, other wars. Yes, they have to go to war against the others. Yes. There are some fun history tidbits in this one, starting here. Raymond Redbeard led them south in the time of my grandfather's grandfather, and before him there was a king named Bael the Bard.
Aye, and long before them came the Horned Lord and the brother kings Gendel and Gorn, and in ancient days Joramun, who blew the horn of winter and woke giants from the earth. Each man of them broke his strength on the wall, or was broken by the power of Winterfell on the far side.
It is not foreshadowing, though. This time the power of the wildlings was certainly slowed by the wall, but broken by a king from the south. Stannis, right? Broken and absorbed, meaning he took the wildlings into his army after defeating them. That is also unprecedented. And this mention of Bael the Bard looms very large, but it's interesting, though, because Jon mentions it, but he doesn't know much about it. It's only a few chapters later that Ygritte tells him this full story, and it's completely new to him. So it sounds like Jon only knew that Bael the Bard was a king beyond the wall. He didn't know the part about him being a Stark ancestor. Now, that's another reason it looms large, is that Mance is going to later pretend to be Abel, A-B-E-L, which is an anagram for Bael, B-A-E-L, and he does a lot of the same things Bael does, pretending to be a musician, trying to kidnap a Stark daughter. Of course, he tries to kidnap fake Arya instead of real Arya, but it's still, the parallel is still pretty straightforward, even despite that. Abram wonders about the mentions of ghost eating children. Like, Gilly seems afraid of that. And it could be a reflection of the old gods, because Ghost looks like a werewood. And thus, it maybe reminds us of the sacrifice of children that's present in this chapter. Now, obviously, I don't think Ghost is ever going to eat a child. But the sacrificing to the werewoods is a big theme, and Ghost looks like them. So you can kind of see maybe why there's being a nod there. We know Chet already. He's the one who plots to murder his fellows and run off. We get the introduction to Lark the Sisterman here in this chapter, along with Ghost. Or rather, interacting with Ghost, not along with Ghost. Of course, Ghost isn't being introduced here. We've known him for a while. There's also talk of Jon's bastardy in this chapter. It's very sneaky, and it's very telling. Quote.
A bastard, is it? Craster looked Jon up and down. Man wants to bet a woman. Seems like he ought to take her to wife. That's what I do.
That is what he does, but...
That's the ethical thing to do, it seems.
So this is really neat, because it could be an indirect reference to Jon's real parentage, which involves his grandparents and farther back ancestors being very incestuous. Obviously, I mean, on the Targaryen side.
Incestors, that's perfect pun.
It's incestors,
yeah. You did not plan that, but incestors. That's what all the Targaryens are, incestors.
How did we not come up with that term before?
I know.
That's a good one. More importantly, it's quite possibly a reference to the notion that Rhaegar and Lyanna were actually married. Which meaning Jon's bastard status might be in doubt. He may turn out to not be a bastard in the long run. Recall too that Craster sees bastard as a huge insult. When he's killed later, that's the word that really sets him off. And Sam points out that Craster is probably a bastard because his father was a Night's Watchman and his mother came from Whitetree. So it's interesting that he's so insulted by something that he probably is. And, to people like us in the real world, we don't see bastardy as even remotely the issue that they see it in mainland Westeros. So it's a little strange that someone like Craster would also think of it this way. Some people wonder about how many generations Craster's been in this incest cycle. We talked about that a little earlier, but yeah, we don't have a strong answer. But as Ashea and I seem to agree that it's probably at most one or two of his wives that are not related to him. With the axe, Mormont's gift, Ed complains about it, and it's kind of a gray area actually, because we learned that it's a crime to sell or trade weapons to the wildlings. Now Ed doesn't mention that, but he just points out, it's not a good idea to give weapons to the wildlings. He says that it's kind of false foreshadowing in a sense. He says Craster's axe is going to kill Mormont. Mormont is going to die at Craster's, so it's close, but Craster's not the one who does it. In fact, when Mormont dies, Craster is already dead. Archmaester Renly asks a great question. Could Craster's father be Bloodraven? Yes, he could be. I don't have anything directly to tie them together, but the question is, does the timeline fit? The answer is yes. Craster is an old man. It's about the year 298 at this point. Bloodraven disappeared beyond the wall in the year 252. He went to the wall at around 130 or 236, I believe it was. So that's a pretty wide range for him to, if Craster is 50 or 60, then that lines up. And 50 or 60 sounds about right for Craster.
It could also be, that Bloodraven would know the man who, slept with the wildling woman.
That's a good point. If it's not him, then he might know who it was because he was Lord Commander during the era that's pretty likely
he would know
Craster's birth.
All the men as Lord Commander, and if it's known, then he would have to decide how to punish him.
Yeah, good point. So speaking of Bloodraven, the Raven doesn't say much in this chapter, but we have to wonder what Bloodraven thinks of Craster. Probably nothing good, but so unless he's his son, he still wouldn't think much good of him. But he would have more complicated thoughts of him if he's his son. Now, given our criticisms of Mormont here, perhaps Bloodraven sees reason to criticize Craster as well. If not his plan, perhaps he disapproves of Craster in general. And this, I think maybe this is what we get here. The Raven craps on Mormont's shoulder immediately after Jon thinks how he's not going to eat Craster's food, but Mormont has just eaten Craster's food. And just before that, Mormont says, best keep an edge on that sword, which is kind of an odd line since Valyrian steel doesn't ever lose its edge, but it's just an expression indicating be ready for action, so we don't need to take that literally. But interestingly, the Raven flies to Longclaw and perches on it right after Mormont says that. So it's like the Raven kind of showing some even more signs of intelligence that we're always on the lookout for. Okay. That is Jon 2, or Jon 3 rather. Really full, thorough chapter. So much to do in that one. Big chapter. I hope we covered it to your satisfaction. Let's move on. Theon 2. Theon tries to bang his sister, aka the gang starts a war. The Iron Gang, that is. Asha isn't yet a point of view, but this chapter is as much about her as it is about him, pretty much. And this is the one where Theon gets his new ship. It's a ship he's only going to sail once. Quote,
she was undeniably a beauty.
I usually save the listener comments for the end, sometimes in the middle, but Stefan B nailed it so well that I'm just going to quote him here. Or rather, Shea is going to quote him here.
Theon's overconfidence is amplified by the fact that, pun intended, fish out of water on the Iron Islands. In the Greenlands, his confidence was at least partly backed by skills in battle and archery. It's very cruel of George to throw this particular character into an environment so alien to him. No comparison to how Arya and Sansa cope.
Yeah, they adapt. This is a really good comment. It's so true. He learns at Winterfell, so of course his skill set is going to be like any northern noble youth is going to be. Thus, not learning how to sail, not learning how to reave and raid. So yeah, and like Stefan says, Arya and Sansa adapt to their surroundings, and Theon just complains and tries to make things fit him, which is more of the like Joffrey, Cersei, Viserys method. Especially in this chapter when Theon has a line like men should fight and die for him simply because he's their prince. We know that's not how it works. We know that people will fight for someone who's not their prince, but they will gladly declare him their prince because they love him, Renly. So just being their prince isn't good enough, especially in times like these when, as we hear elsewhere, kings are, sprouting like mushrooms after a rain. And it makes sense for Balon to send experienced people like Dagmar Cleftjaw with Theon because of this lack of experience. Now, Theon takes it as an insult because he doesn't really recognize that problem in himself. Dagmar will later try to explain this to him, but it doesn't really steer Theon off of his frustration, nor certainly doesn't steer him off of his eventual ambitious plan to take Winterfell. Now, beyond these obvious cultural blind spots that Theon is showing, there's also small signs that he just lacks the typical Ironborn toughness. The little signs like the smell of thick cream making him queasy, and that he can't hold his wine, that he's unsteady on the rope bridge in the storm, how he reacts to being embarrassed by Asha is not very tough. He kind of it pushes him. It shows him. It gets him off his game, and it's not good to be off your game, as we see like Cersei. As Tyrion points out, I like when Cersei is paranoid and not, rather than being cold and calculating. One of the ways Theon tries to pretend he's closer to his culture than he really is are when he thinks things like the sea is in my blood and I'm a born Greyjoy, so I can do these things. So he's projecting. Your blood doesn't make up for your lack of sailing experience, dude. But he might be right in an indirect way, in a way that he's not fully aware of. And in fact, he's probably not aware at all that there's things in the ancient past with the Ironborn that may indicate that his blood does make him a little different, like all Ironborn. There is some evidence that the Ironborn are a race apart, even though this is such an ancient distinction. Still, their past contains some very dark connections. The drowned god may be a modern interpretation of an ancient truth. In other words, it's a great excuse for us to do a little delving into these super ancient legends surrounding the Ironborn, especially since it's this chapter where we get this quote.
Lord Balon occupied the sea stone chair, carved in the shape of a great kraken from an immense block of oily black stone. Legend said the first men had found it standing on the shore of Old Wick when they came to the Iron Island.
Oh yeah, the oily black stone. I can call it the OBS, even though it's also the name of our
live streaming software.
Yeah.
It's perfect. OBS. That's a very mysterious
streaming software.
Yeah.
It's ancient from a time before software.
It's very powerful, though, too.
It is very powerful. Now I have a few different things to say about the Oily Black Stone in Dany 2, which is only a few chapters from now, because it relates to different aspects of ancient history and backstory. There'll be more when we get to Euron 2. But Euron as well, not Euron 2. But here in Theon 2, the relevant thing is the Ironborn's blood. The phrase, "what is dead may never die," was introduced last chapter. And as many of you are aware, that's a notable nod to H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote, quote,
"That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die."
That line appears in The Call of Cthulhu, one of maybe his most famous stories. It also appears in the Metallica song, "The Thing That Should Not Be." But hey, that's another project, a topic rather.
Yeah, it's too bad we couldn't just play that.
Yeah, copyright strikes incoming.
Also, I think it would have disturbed our listeners very much.
Sudden heavy metal. I agree that this is an inspiration for the drowned god. That Cthulhu is an inspiration for the drowned god. I mean, think of what Cthulhu is: a horrific tentacled monster who lives beneath the sea, has a cult, drives people insane, and gives other people nightmares. So, I mean, that's pretty close. We don't know what the drowned god looks like, whether he's a horrible tentacled monster, but they do worship krakens, the Greyjoys and others. And, the living beneath the sea, the worship of him is pretty cult-like, especially look at someone like Aeron, who's on display in this chapter. Anyway, so that's there's a lot more to say about that, but this is not where we do full deep dives and things like that. We have them on other episodes like The Great Empire of the Dawn and things like that. Joe Buckley calls this the best chapter in the series for reread purposes. It's hilarious. It's a personal favorite of his because he just loves the how silly Theon looks. And the humiliation is incredibly specific to Theon's particular psyche. His whole intro has been about finding power through dominating women, but here he is not only completely hoodwinked by one, he then finds out the same woman is far more respected and far more entrenched in this, quote, male model of the Ironborn. She has taken the role. Asha is what Theon wants to be. And this is galling to him because he looks down on women, and she's just better than he is at all of this. And she's really masterful in her manipulation. It's such a great introduction.
We've just to interrupt you, we've got a really good quote for right here, too.
Okay, I'll go
Balon
for it.
even refers to Asha as a son.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Right here saying, Victarion, Lord Balon said to his brother, the main thrust shall fall to you. When my sons have struck their blows, Winterfell must respond.
Yeah, Theon doesn't respond to it that way, but it's still very telling. Like, he doesn't take note of her being called a son, but we certainly do, and it's a big deal. So it's really cool too. Like, another point Joe makes here that I really agree with. She turns his usual sexual interactions on their head, learning information from him about Robb and his wars and Theon's personality. And I mean, it's true. She just completely owns him. Theon's ambition is very much on display, but so is Asha's. Like I said at the beginning, this chapter is as much about her as it is about him. She recognizes Theon as a potential rival and just does the best thing you can do to a power rival, other than kill them, is to just make him look weak. That's such a big deal in the Ironborn, the Ironborn culture. He hasn't been seen in 10 years, and immediately he's being embarrassed. It's a bad way to make your debut among your people, and he's aware of it. He's sort of aware of it, and he kind of lies to himself. And at one point, he finally starts to show a little bit of self-awareness, where he says, she made me look so, it's like, I look so bad, I made such a fool of myself. But then his narcissism just kicks back and he says, no, she made a fool of me, it's her fault. It's like, oh, Theon, you were almost there, you almost started taking responsibility, but no. And he blames Wex, his squire, for not telling him, things like that. He blames anybody but himself. Almost blames himself, but then he's like, no, I'm not gonna blame myself. Now, interestingly, there's a kind of a odd little reference here. Theon tells a story about playing a harp and keeping Esgrid high in a tower. Is this a little bit of Rhaegar nod here? He probably heard the story about Rhaegar, at least a little bit about it. The Rhaegar's harp is, people know about that. I don't think we get much Ironborn thinking about Rhaegar anywhere, but in general, they'd be more supportive of multiple wives, given their culture. So let's talk about Balon's plan for a second. It's funny how terrible Balon's war plan is. It's so bad that it almost speaks for itself, but in some ways it doesn't, because it's terrible in so many different ways that even a thorough analysis doesn't reveal all the reasons it's bad. There's so many angles to the badness of his strategy that it takes y'all have written in with so many different things that are wrong with this plan. And there's so many valid angles to why it's wrong, and no one has covered all of it, because there's just so many reasons why this plan is bad. Maybe George is making some kind of statement about a lot of wars are started like this for bad reasons, with a bad chance of success, just because of things like grievances and pride, which is a huge key to Balon's position here. As Asha herself points out later, the North is too full of Northmen. That's one big problem with it. They will take it back eventually. You're not going to be able to hold it. They don't have enough manpower. And that includes the key to Balon's plan, Moat Catelyn. He thinks he's trapped Robb in the south, but we know better. Yeah, he's not wrong that if Robb attacks Moat Catelyn from the south, he's going to have a hard time of it. But it's not hard to take from the north, and we just pointed out there's plenty of northerners left in the north. Yeah, a lot of them went south with Robb, but there's still plenty left up there. There's plenty to attack Moat Catelyn from its undefended side. So in the very next Theon chapter, it comes up that the Ironborn are not skilled in siege warfare. That goes both ways. Being not skilled at using siege warfare also means you aren't skilled at defending against it. They're not that skilled at defense in general. So they don't have the skills to hold the North, to defend the North, let alone the manpower. So they don't have any of the things it takes for this plan to work. So, but there's more reasons it's dumb. It's not just the difficulty in holding it. It's why the North. It's the poorest of the regions, while also being the largest. So you just get less bang for your difficult to hold buck. Now Asha goes to take Deepwood Motte. She's successful, but so what? It's not an important place. It's not a strategic spot at all. It's just one of the northern castles on the coast. It's like, well, we want to take that back, but it's not some great strategic holding that allows them to hit the north in a lot of different places. It's pretty weak. So, gosh, most importantly though, perhaps the dumbest thing of all, probably the dumbest thing of all, he's attacking the one kingdom willing to ally with him and the one kingdom willing to help him fight for his own independence. And this is all just because of his grudges. It's incredibly stupid and small-minded. Robb is just about, as we saw in the last chapter, or 2 chapters ago rather, is about to start hammering the West with his army. Imagine if Balon was doing that at the same time. That would have been really effective. Not only that, if Balon does beat Robb, it doesn't get him independence. He still has to contend with the Iron Throne while holding the North, who aren't going to be easily held. So he's going to end up, he's basically setting himself up, even if he beats Robb, to have to continue to fight the rest of the North while also holding on to his new kingdom from people like Tywin. Balon tries to ally with Tywin later, and Tywin basically says the same thing we just said about the Northerners eventually pushing him out. He's like, I'm going to ignore Balon's offer. Let's ignore it. He ignores it. How's your pride liking that, Balon? I mean, he's one of the reasons he strikes out is because of his pride, and just pitfalls here. It just gets worse. But one thing he does have in common with Tywin is he, like Tywin, won't see just how big a failure his legacy is going to be, given his death is going to come before his plans start to really sink. I can imagine the Drowned God just like shaking his head at Balon when he arrives. He's like, good attitude, son, but terrible planning, you know? I like your attitude bringing back the old way, but you should have thought it through a lot better. But Theon will see this collapse. Theon is going to see it, and in that we will see part of what gives him his huge character change, from naive and cocky to wary and, well, Ramsay made sure he's definitely not cocky. Vandalay Industries latex salesman and friend of the show Dom Tartaglia wants to know if there's any real-world inspiration for the finger dance, which we see introduced in this chapter. This is another conversation that had more meat to it on Facebook because a lot of ideas were thrown about. I don't know, so I'm not going to bring up all these different details because it's so uncertain. But one thing that was mentioned in that thread that I think has a chance to be the inspiration is the knife game, where people are going to go the knife between the fingers, back and forth.
Yeah, when I was first reading the books and heard about, the finger dance, that's exactly what I thought it was going to be. And then obviously she gets thrown her blades and you're like, oh, this is something else entirely.
Yeah. Jaded Redhead, may I kindly ask for a shout out from my husband, Derek, whose birthday is on Halloween. Well, yeah, happy birthday, Derek. No. That's
why I put it there. No.
Sorry,
Derek.
So I wouldn't
no
read
shout out. Yeah.
Another great point in this chapter that I didn't put in my notes, but I was just recalling, is that Victarion is later pointed out that he never laughs. He doesn't trust laughter, but he laughs in this chapter, and it's because he's never sure if the joke is at him or not. But in this chapter, it's so abundantly clear that people are laughing at Theon because Asha chops his bowl of stew in half and the cream goes all over him. And so clearly it's this physical humor where there's no doubt who's being laughed at. So it's pretty bad when a guy who never laughs at you. And it's his own uncle, his own family member. So here's a description of Asha. Let's talk about Asha's looks, because it's another example of someone who doesn't quite look the same in the books and show. Although she's less different than some others, she's still definitely different. Quote,
Ironborn, he knew at a glance, lean and long-legged, with black hair cut short, wind-chafed skin, strong, sure hands, a dirk at her belt. Her nose was too big and too sharp for her thin face, but her smile made up for it. He judged her a few years older than he was, but no more than 25. She moved as if she were used to a deck beneath her feet.
Unlike him, who, as we already pointed out, does not move as if he was used to a deck beneath his feet, because he's not used to a deck beneath his feet.
Also, you could think Theon probably isn't Ironborn. He knew at a glance. No one probably looks at him and is like, that's an Ironborn.
Good point. He maybe, from his appearance, but like his clothing, she'd be like, ooh, what is up with that dude? So compare that to that description to Gemma Whalen. I guess it's a rare example of them not like way attractifying the character. Not that Gemma Whalen isn't attractive, but they didn't go for like super hot, where they did do that for a lot of the other characters.
She is older.
Yeah.
Which is the same across the board for the most part.
That is
but
true.
No, Asha in the books, it is such a very particular description there. I don't know. It was very notable to me when she was described. She has just such sharp features and the leanness and long. It's just very different than Gemma.
Gemma Whalen's hair is longish. It's not short like Asha's, and her hair isn't black. She doesn't have wind-chafed skin, but
or this big nose and thin, sharp face. But yeah, anyways.
Also, her name is Yara, not Asha on the show. And Yara is bisexual. George R. R. Martin says that Asha is not, so that's interesting.
Yeah, and well, I think Gemma has been like, it's Pan, or I don't know, whatever.
Yeah. Theon is at least accurate in guessing her age. He thinks she's no more than 25, and she is about 23. Another really interesting difference here, Nina points out that Asha is, we see here that Asha cares about her mother, and Theon, despite not having been home in 10 years, has not bothered to go see her, which is just another thing designed to make us dislike Theon. There's so many reasons why we don't like Theon, but not, going to see your mother after 10 years is just like, come on, dude, that's something that everyone in the real world can be like. What's that?
Your depressed mother, too.
Yeah, he's very depressed, traumatized
lost
mother.
Everything.
Yeah.
Well, not quite everything, but lost her boys, her sons.
Yeah. And feels like, and she later, we'll see, she asks about Theon and is like, and Asha's like, I don't want to tell you what happened to him. But she also like, it's like, damn it, Theon, you should have at least come to see her. He's also oblivious about other things. Here's a quote.
Iron men did not bend their knees often nor easily, but Theon noted that oarsmen and townfolk alike grew quiet as they passed and acknowledged him with respectful bows of the head.
So when he realizes that it's Asha, he thinks back on all the embarrassing things he did, but this is not one of the things he realizes. They were not bowing their heads to him, probably. They were bowing to her. It's possible they were bowing to both, but definitely they're bowing to Asha because they know her and they don't know him.
Yeah, and he thinks, he's like, oh, they're finally learning.
Yeah. And here's another quote that just, yet again, a reason to be like, gosh, Theon, you suck.
That's my cursed luck. I kill the poor.
And this is when he thinks about how he doesn't have any things he paid the iron price for to dress up in when he goes to this feast.
So that's your luck. You kill the poor.
Yeah.
Not that it's not the poor's luck, but also notable because, of course, his Winterfell plotline, he kills the poor.
He sure did. Stefan B., whose name's coming up a lot in this one, a lot of good catches from him in this one. He says, he points out the Theon thinks, may the others take her about Asha, which, interestingly, might be more than just a casual line. It's probably just a curse, but given where she is in A Dance with Dragons, which is in the north, held by Stannis captive with a busted ankle. So, yeah, if Stannis gets overrun by the others, which is entirely possible, she could still be his captive when things go bad, and when the others arrive, if they break through the wall. So she might get taken by the others, which would be a very different from her show ending, but I think we kind of already have good reason to think that she's going to have a different ending on the books than the show, which is a great reason to pay more attention to whatever foreshadowing and little tidbits George says about her, because we're on the lookout for something different. That is it for Theon 2. Let us go to Tyrion 6. The gang here is Stannis is fighting Renly, aka the one where Shagga's a barber. Quote, let's go right to it.
Through the door came the soft sound of the high harp, mingled with a trilling of pipes.
Cersei has musicians, and they're playing a song that's familiar to Tyrion as he's approaching her quarters. So let's go right to the next few lines as well. Quote,
the singer's voice was muffled by the thick walls, yet Tyrion knew the verse. I loved a maid as fair as summer, he remembered, with sunlight in her hair.
In this we have a blatant, I say, example of something that means nothing to a first-time reader, yet looms hugely on rereads. That is the song Tyrion associates with Tysha, but he does not think of that here. The connection is not made clear until his final chapter in this book. It's almost like a climactic moment, because it's his, that's usually what final chapters in multi-book epics do. They set big things up. So there's no indication he's thinking about Tysha here. He's only thought about Tysha a little bit at all to this point in his arc. So it's a impossible to get thing on the first time through. Now, we love to talk about how Tyrion has so much in common with Tywin. There are also, of course, major differences. And of course, I don't mean the obvious ones like appearance. I mean that when Tywin comes to resume his duty as Hand, he cows Joffrey and Cersei. They just wilt under his just authority and presence and potency, whereas Tyrion has to work around them, right? He's constantly kind of managing things despite their interference and their clumsiness and things like that. And this really peaks in this chapter where he, one, distracts Joffrey with a new toy, that crossbow, while also dosing Cersei with this bottle he stole from Pycelle. But these are short-term solutions. These are just, like I said, short distractions. They're not going to last forever. But that's okay. He doesn't have to keep this up forever. He's not going to be Hand forever. He's only going to be Hand until the war is over or until Tywin comes to take the job back. Now, it's the perfect moment for Cersei to be drugged, because she's in a rare, happy moment, because Tyrion delivers the news that Renly and Stannis are fighting each other. A small tidbit here is Cersei kissing Lancel very chastely, which is sneaky considering what we're about to learn about their relationship, but not till next episode. She's funny and charming when she's not paranoid sometimes. She has a lot of funny lines in the series, although not many of them have come yet. More and more of them are going to be coming over the next few books. Tyrion thinks how beautiful she is. He just realizes when she's being sweet, when she's smiling, it's really quite astonishing how lovely she is. Something that Kevin thinks about later too. It's a big deal. And he thinks, in light of that, he thinks of this loved a maid quote again while thinking about her because of her hair and her smiles, which is,
I mean, I don't think we really see a lot of that in Game of Thrones at all in the show. We don't see her, I don't know, as joyful.
Not too often, no.
No.
Like, there are some moments of joy for her, but yeah.
I mean, I don't see her certainly laughing and twirling around like this.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, this moment didn't happen where she actually picks Tyrion up and spins him around. Yeah, that doesn't happen.
No.
Lena Headey doesn't lift Peter Dinklage up. So on Cersei, I want to say a few things. She's not a good mother, but she is protective. That is at least something even Tyrion acknowledges that is apart from her cheekbones. He says kind of jokingly that it's her best quality, protecting her protectiveness. But she does remain very interesting as a reread, because the more we parse her TV version, which was a really strong presence. I mean, Lena Headey was really owned that role really well. A lot of people, even those of us who have lots of fair complaints about the show, it's hard to complain about Lena Headey's acting and her portrayal. I mean, there are fair criticisms of it, but she was very strong. but she's purely antagonistic in the books at this point. She has not earned much sympathy, if any. And even later, she may not earn much. In her POV, it's not like Jaime, where we start to see, oh, he's not entirely bad. He's got some good points. Some of his, the vow thing, he's starting to become a better person. He's not rehabilitated, but, there are times where you root for him, and some people root for him a lot. Cersei, pretty much just, there's not a lot of rooting for her at any point, though it does happen in the show a little bit. There's definitely people who are Cersei stans, show Cersei, but book Cersei does not have a lot of stans.
That's a good point. Yeah, that is.
And this is part of why there is less to like about her, and there's no great acting portrayal to kind of help win us over. You don't there's no, I really like that actress. It's part of why people like Theon on the show too, where we don't have that here, because there's no Alfie Allen to win us over. It's really similar for Theon, or for Cersei / Lena Headey. But moving on, there's an interesting quote here that Ashea, you noted this one. I like this quote.
Tyrion looked down on them all and found he liked it.
Of course, he's on the Iron Throne when that quote is made. And it kind of reminds me of the old small man casting a large shadow kind of reference type thing. Also, maybe a reference to his possible dragon riding later. If that happens, well, he would be looking down on them all from an even higher vantage point. And Dany, at one point, words it kind of similarly. So we also have in this chapter Kleos and the fake offer, meaning sending the guards with 4 of them who are plants as undercover operatives to try to free Jaime. Ed Muir is going to describe how that goes down in what's going to be our part 7. That's Catelyn 5. Tywin's influence on Tyrion shows up when Tyrion publicly declares in front of court that Kleos should tell Robb that they're willing to trade 2 Northerners for every single Lannister. Certain specific examples are given, but the specifics aren't important. The point is that he's publicly declaring that Lannisters are worth more than Northerners, and that's the kind of sentiment that Tywin would appreciate and approve of, and you can see where Tyrion gets that. Now, here's another catch that Ashea made here that's really good. It's not clear what everyone thinks of Arya at this point, but it becomes clear here because she's brought up. Kleos says, as you say, to Tyrion, and his sisters?
Tyrion glanced toward Sansa and felt a stab of pity as he said, "Until such time as he frees my brother Jaime, unharmed, they shall remain here as hostages. How well they are treated depends on him. And if the gods are good, Bywater will find Arya alive before Robb learns she's gone missing."
So he's just lied to Kleos and the rest of the court, saying he's got Arya, but Sansa knows better. Sansa, who's sitting there listening, who's been thinking she's hoping that that Arya's gotten to Winterfell or Riverrun, and she's imagined that she has. Now she knows that she's not. So Tyrion has renewed confidence that she's still somewhere in King's Landing from this moment, because he knows that Kleos...
Yeah, she's not with Robb.
Yeah, Kleos has just revealed that Arya's not with Robb, so Tyrion's like, okay, well, maybe she is here. So no one knows where she is, but they both have... So now Sansa knows that no one knows where she is, and Tyrion knows that the North doesn't have her.
No one does know where she is.
No one does. Nice. So Tyrion has concern for his dignity when Alistair Thorne is speaking of the dead. It's kind of a theme here, the Lannister pride, but also his own pride, because he knows how important it is for people not to laugh at him, because he's already constantly being laughed at, and he can't allow that to get out of hand. He needs to be taken seriously. He needs to maintain his authority. And so, what better way than to spin that and to make them laugh at Alistair before they could ever laugh at him? Now, Alistair is just terrible at this. He's horrible at diplomacy. He's possibly worse at this than he was at training, being the Master at Arms at the Night's Watch, and he was bad at that. He calls Tyrion imp. He calls the small council servants and says this matter is too important to be brought before anyone but the king. And he's talking about Joffrey like Joffrey's going to do anything. I mean, good job, Alistair. You stink. So we have also confronting Pycelle, who just continues even as he's being dragged away. Varys, it was Varys. It's pretty pathetic. And it's a funny scene. For example, there's urine spraying in all directions, which is because as Shagga's shaving him, he's like just terrified. Because I mean, to be fair, we would all be terrified too. It's Timett and Shagga that are busting down his door. Like, those are terrifying folk. and then, but we get a great line here. Tyrion's like, "Don't worry," because Pycelle's with some serving girl, some young lady, and she's terrified too. And Tyrion's like, "Don't worry, we don't want you." And Shagga's like, "I want her." and Timett's like, "You want all the women," and he's like, "Yeah, I do. I'll give them strong sons." So Shagga's funny. I like Shagga.
He wants to Shagga all the women.
I actually never got that. It's good. That might be it. Shagga. Yeah. He does want to shag them all. Despite Pycelle's lame protestations, the line, "Make no mistake, for every secret the eunuch whispers in your ear, he holds 7 back," is true. I mean, that is 100% accurate about Varys. So, but still, he has no call to blame Varys for this particular thing. It was definitely 100% his leak of Tyrion's plan about Myrcella and Dorne that got him in this pickle. However, I think it's fair, and other people have made this point in our chats and in our on Facebook and Flick, that maybe this was not the right way to handle it. I mean, sure, it's fair to say that Tyrion can't trust Pycelle, but Pycelle is a Lannister toady, and you can make use of that. And he even realizes that this is, despite catching Pycelle, it doesn't prove that Varys and Littlefinger aren't untrustworthy. He knows they're untrustworthy. He just didn't catch them at it. So, it's it's not, maybe not the best way he could have handled it, but it's still fun to see Tyrion operate. Lancel points out here that... What's up?
Oh, nothing. I was just laughing at that when you said Lancel points out here.
Lancel, with his infinite wisdom, he says, "I would have had their tongues out," which is in referring to the preachers. Cersei said the same thing just a few chapters ago. So you can see that he's probably getting that from her. It's probably not his, his own opinion. He's just parroting her. I mean, he's 16. He's not supposed to, he's not some really smart kid. He's just pretty much being manipulated by Cersei. But more on that in the next chapter when we get deeper into their relationship. Here's the quote we referred to earlier. Let's actually read it rather than just talking about it. It's a bizarre image, isn't it?
Tyrion threw back his head and roared. They laughed together. Cersei pulled him off the bed and whirled him around and even hugged him for a moment, as giddy as a girl.
On top of that, next week, when Renly and Stannis parlay, when they have their, what I call banter battle, and it goes poorly, Catelyn is going to think this.
Cersei Lannister is laughing herself breathless, Catelyn thought wearily.
Yep. Breathless indeed. She lifts him up and spins him around, and that's going to make her breathless. So, also in reference to Alistair Thorne, he talks about, he makes everybody laugh at him by sending spades with him. And he's like, "Spades? What are those for?" He walks into the joke. Quote,
"If you bury your dead, they won't come walking," Tyrion told him.
But really, that's not true.
Yeah, they will. You should be burning them.
Yes.
This obviously makes us think of the crypts of Winterfell.
Yes, you should not be burying them. You should be burning them. The North forgot that one. They usually remember, but that's one where they forgot. The Knights watched it too. Gior even says it. "We should have remembered." Yes, fire. Anyway, here's another line that's we both, Shay and I, that is, think is really funny. Quote,
"Littlefinger was not appeased. I do not like being lied to, my lord. Leave me out of your next deception." This is like doubly hilarious to me because Littlefinger is very deceitful, but also does anyone like being lied to and want to be part of like a deception that they don't know about? No, no one does.
Leave me out of your next assassination attempt.
Yeah.
Yeah, like stating the obvious.
Yeah, talk about Captain Obvious.
Yeah. Littlefinger goes from ultra subtle to Captain Obvious. And here's another line.
May they battle long and hard, and the others take them both.
Yeah, that's of course Stannis and Renly being talked about. Now, the others are not going to take Renly because the Shadow Baby's taking him. But the others might take Stannis. That could very much happen. And how perfect is this? We did not plan this. We couldn't have planned this. I didn't even catch this quote until this reread. And y'all know I've read the books a lot of times, countless times. We have a Halloween quote. We have an actual Halloween reference, and it's the only one I'm aware of, but it is in this chapter. What timing? Quote.
Cersei bolted to her feet, and yet you sit there grinning like a Harvest Day pumpkin.
Harvest Day pumpkin.
Grinning,
yeah.
Yeah, it's a jack-o'-lantern.
Hell yeah. That's awesome. In this case, it's a Tyrion-o-lantern. Tyrio-lantern. Because that line comes when she says Stannis has sailed, and she's like, "What?" Bah! And then that's before she tells him he's told her that he sailed for for Storm's End. So here's another question from Stefan B, who, as I've said, is crushing it today with the questions. Was giving Stannis Dragonstone meant as a slight? Cersei indicates in this chapter that it was, and that seems to be a popular interpretation. However, we don't have to interpret this. George has done it from us. Quote from the SSM right here.
But it's not necessarily true that Robert meant it that way. The Targaryen heir apparent had always been titled Prince of Dragonstone. By making Stannis the Lord of Dragonstone, Robert affirmed his brother's status as heir, which he was until Joff's birth a few years later. Robert could just as lawfully retained both castles for his sons and made Joffrey the Prince of Dragonstone and Tommen the Lord of Storm's End. Giving them to his brothers, instead, was another instance of his great, but rather careless, generosity. I think that's the more accurate idea myself. I don't see Robert as particularly malicious towards at least his brothers, to certain people a little bit, but I don't think he is malicious towards Stannis, or certainly not Renly.
I mean, of course it's George, so it's law, it's word,
yeah,
the word of God, but it fits
he's
so
not
well.
Saying that this is the case.
Yeah,
however.
he says not necessarily, because he doesn't always like to fully explain what his character's thinking of. He wants to leave some nuance and to leave some mystery. But it does fit really well. I agree with that. It's very strong to say Robert Robert isn't vindictive. Robert isn't petty like that.
He's like, oh, screw Stannis.
Yeah, it's Stannis interpreted that way.
Even though he did do some very disrespectful things to Stannis, but again, careless.
Careless makes more sense, yeah, that rather than intentional insult. Now, Cersei would have done that. That's the kind of thing Cersei would do. So she sees it as an insult because it looks like that to her and to Stannis and to a lot of others. So it's fair to interpret it that way, but as George says, that's not necessarily accurate. And that does it for Tyrion 6. Now, Arya 6. The gang gets tickled, aka the one where Arya starts her list. And it isn't pretty. This is an extremely brutal chapter. George R.R. Martin does a great job of writing Lovecraft-style fear and horror, as we've explained in the Theon chapter, and of course in chapters like the prologue. But this one is more in line with modern slasher films, but with the very notable difference of the gore and torture being mostly implied rather than directly seen. And that's a huge difference from the TV show. They just really wanted to show the torture. This overwhelming aspect of this chapter begins, as it so often does, with the first line. Just boom, right away.
Fear cuts deeper than swords, Arya would tell herself, but that did not make the fear go away.
We all like to talk about how George does gray characters really well and how most of them are gray, but not all. If every character was gray, well, that would be just as unrealistic as trying to, as trying to make everyone black and white. Well, maybe not as unrealistic, but unrealistic, because some people are just awful. There's just basically no rehabilitating them, even if you point out that Gregor Clegane has, maybe a bad upbringing and that he's in constant pain. But
yeah,
still,
that could be true, and then maybe he still is irredeemable. He will never ever be a better person.
Yeah,
even if it wasn't his fault that he became the way he was. Well,
there's no taming him.
Yeah, there's no taming
rehabilitating
him. Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah, you can, even if you recognize that he is a product of his environment, it doesn't mean you can do anything about it. And he, the kind of guy like him, he attracts like-minded, well, not souls, but beasts. Let's say this chapter is full of torture, rape, executions. The villagers are blamed for harboring Beric Dondarrion, even though they had no choice. They just had stuff taken from them. Here's an interesting little point too. It's we get the list, which is cool. This is our first time. Quote:
Ser Gregor, she'd whisper to her stone pillow. Dunson, Polliver, Chiswick, Raff the Sweetling, the Tickler and the Hound, Ser Armory, Ser Ilyn, Ser Meryn, Ser Joffrey, Queen Cersei.
Sir Joffrey, you said.
Oh, you're right. That's what I think of him. He's no king to me. I shouldn't have even made him a knight. Joffrey.
And
really?
Yeah.
Arya shouldn't call them King and Queen Cersei.
Well, that's someone actually made that comment that it's
Oh.
interesting that she gives them their titles.
She offers them that
Sir
respect.
Armory, Sir Ilyn.
Yeah, that is interesting.
It's their full.
I mean,
title.
I to a certain respect, it makes me think of the idea of her being disillusioned with these titles.
Yeah, right.
They are knights, they are kings and queens, and they are terrible.
Yeah. So, from that list, Chiswick is going to go first in her next chapter, and then Wheeze right after. He's added and killed in Arya 8, though she regrets it and tries to stop it from happening because she thinks of it. She realizes it's a waste to kill Wheeze, but she is too late to stop it. Of course, in this chapter 2, we get some world building. We got Harrenhal, which is a location that is in the top 5 for most chapters and scenes, I think, in the entire series. It's behind Winterfell and King's Landing and the Wall, but there's a lot at Harrenhal. It starts here, but we also get, we get a lot of Arya here. We get Jaime here. We get Brienne. Brienne, really remembering it. It's quite a bit. And, well, it's introduced like this, quote:
It would not be much longer, she told herself. Those towers cannot be more than a few miles off. Yet they walked all that day and most of the next, before at last they reached the fringes of Lord Tywin's army, encamped west of the castle amidst the scorched remains of a town. Harrenhal was deceptive from afar because it was so huge. Its colossal curtain walls rose beside the lake, sheer and sudden as mountain cliffs, while atop their battlements the rows of wood and iron scorpions looked as small as the bugs for which they were named.
Yeah, all of those wood and iron scorpions tried to take down Balerion, and instead Balerion took down those towers. Well, not all the way down, but he melted them, and they were never the same. Now, there is very little separating these villagers that Gregor is leading to Harrenhal, among also other villagers who were led there prior, from slaves. I mean, there's almost nothing that change. That they have no freedom to leave. They're forced to come and serve Tywin. It's really not much different than slavery.
Yeah, I mean, it's they're concentration camps.
Yeah,
and
you're
that
right.
woman has the nerve to tell Arya that this will be a better world for her.
Yeah,
That's what she tells her.
and then is so brutal to her after Arya's like, "I'd rather tend the stables," and she smacks her and is like, "Okay, if you're gonna talk, then you're going to wheeze." Like,
Yes.
that's cruel. And of course, this is an old woman, also a product of her environment, but one of the few who has actually survived from the prior regime.
And thinks she's all the better for it. That's
Yeah.
what she thinks.
Yeah.
She may well be. She may well be one of the few people that has actually benefited.
Yeah. And I will, we'll have a Where Are They Now on a lot of these characters, including Arya's list and including these two women, Good Wife Hera and Good Wife Amabel, who, as you might guess, they don't have a great future. So here's an interesting point. We get sneaky references to Aerys. Here's a quote.
King Aerys, gods grace him, the old man said too loudly.
And that was in reference to how this old man is saying, no, it wouldn't have been like this under the old king. And Arya's like, Robert? And, Arya wasn't alive during Aerys' time, so she has no idea what this means. But it's it's George doing some cross chapter background building here. It's a hint here that Aerys was awful, but his awfulness was pointed almost exclusively at the nobility. He didn't torture small folk. He didn't burn small folk. He didn't really care about them. And since there wasn't much war during his era, they mostly had peace and plenty. So a lot of small folk remember being under Aerys as a pretty good time, which is an interesting way for George to present it. It very much touches on what Jorah says to Dany about they don't care. They don't care about the commoners. Don't care. All they care is that High Lords, leave them alone when they play their Game of Thrones. Varys and Jorah both express things like this, and this is also brought up in Dany's next chapter. We'll see that when we get to it. So George is reinforcing the idea by putting this thing about Aerys in 2 consecutive chapters with 2 different POVs. So that's really important. I think that's pretty huge. This just builds the idea that Aerys was not such a simple thing, even though he was the Mad King and his actions were brutal and horrible, and the rebellion was as justified as a rebellion could ever be. It's no more complicated than that. It is more complicated than that. Arguably, Aerys' reign was better for the commoners than Robert's, even though you could say the way Aerys ruled was bound to cause disruptions and maybe civil wars. You could argue that he set all these things in motion, but that doesn't mean the commoners will see it that way. They might be wrong, but their perception is that it's simple. It's like,
you could say that's true for Robert.
Yeah, you're right. So so back to the back to mentioning the torture just for a second here. The show just had to have all that, right? They just had to show, the Tickler doing his thing, and they just like they had to show Theon's torture, I suppose. But so instead of that, we didn't get all for Joffrey. This old guy was all for Joffrey.
A lot of people in the chat were just bringing that up before you even mentioned this. They're like, all for Joff, all for Joff.
It's funny that this is a joke because it's pretty sad. All for Joffrey's a little too loud and he gets tortured.
Yeah, I know.
Like
he's just trying to save himself.
Yeah, and he might have been genuine. Authentic.
Yeah, I mean, not like everyone knows that he's just a little asshole.
Yeah. Oh, it's so sad.
Or a big one, I guess.
Well, okay, so we're done with Arya 6 here. It's the shortest chapter of this batch. There's a lot more Arya chapters coming, but there's no need for us to over-describe all the brutality. Even there's plenty of other things we had to say about that chapter, but that's those little bits, like the books. We'll leave that to be implied rather than the show that has to thrust it in our face. So let's go to Daenerys 2. The gang finally learns Robert is dead, aka the one where they explore Qarth. We took note of some world-building detail in Vase Teloro, and the Kothi people seem to be big on using snakes in their artwork and design. We saw cups with snake handles, and here we see similar imagery right here in the first line of the chapter. Quote,
"On the walls of Qarth, men beat gongs to herald her coming, while others blew curious horns that encircled their bodies like great bronze snakes.
The 3 wise men she meet become part of what I've termed the Qarth arc. And that's Qarth arc, the arc of the Qarthine characters. And how Vargo Hoat would pronounce the word Karstark. Qarth arc, yeah. And Vargo Hoat does care about the Karstarks, but never actually says that name. So I do think he's probably how he would say it. Anyway, that's beside the point. And in turn, each of these 3 wise men, yes, one of them is actually a woman, become part of
is she?
Or is she?
Know.
She's wearing a mask. Do we know for sure? Each of these become a part of the greater Dany plot arc, and all of them are still going. Some people aren't huge fans of these Qarth chapters, but I am. I'm a huge fan of them, and the fact that all these plot devices that get started here are still in play books later shows how important they are. So Xaro is still alive, Quaithe is still alive and is probably sending more visions, and Pyat Pri, well, the Warlocks want revenge on Dany, and Euron has co-opted that revenge, or it's not revenge in his mind, but he's co-opted their plans and their stuff. Very lucky for Euron, extremely unlucky for them. But still, that plot line is in motion in a different way, and 3 of those warlocks are still alive, though they might wish they weren't, given their location in the hold of the Silence being tortured. So Dany has only 5 chapters in Clash, and 4 of them are here in Qarth. which is as far away from Westeros as anyone in the story we've ever seen or going to see. Although there are seeds planted here that continue to grow, that continue to remain mysterious and significant. Even though we hear about farther away places, like I said, this is as far as we're ever going to be present for a POV. Just as important as the welcome, or is the welcome she receives here. It's so much fanfare. They're blowing horns, beating gongs. This is an underappreciated part of Dany's arc. It's not just the overwhelming amount of evidence presented to her that she's actually special, but just how often she's reminded of that. It comes up in many different ways, too, okay? Performing miracles, and coming to one of the fanciest cities on the planet and being treated like a rock star because of that miracle. So, and she's really young. So given her age, she's like forming this worldview as she goes with questionable mentors and a very atypical upbringing, not to mention all the supernatural stuff happening all around her with her dreams and birthing dragons. So this outlook of hers is formed by seeing herself as having this very strong sense of destiny. I don't blame her. I mean, the comet she thinks leads her to Qarth, and so many of these things just seem to be lining up for her. It's fascinating to see how this becomes part of who she is. Quote,
"The bleeding star led me to Qarth for a purpose. Here I will find what I need if I have the strength to take what is offered and the wisdom to avoid the traps and snares. If the gods mean for me to conquer, they will provide. They will send me a sign. And if not...
If you look back, you're lost. Are those the words you're looking for there, Dany? Yeah, something like that, probably. And there's really nothing like a very young person getting treated like royalty and a rock star and a religious icon all at once. It's just, how can that not go to your head? Qarth is already a city of wonders. They call themselves the greatest city that ever was or ever will be. So to be welcomed with that fanfare in a city like this is a really big deal. I mean, these are people that are probably kind of hard to impress. This is a city full of wonders, so they got to have a high bar for what qualifies as a wonder. I mean, this city, just on the outside, you can already tell how fancy it is. Before we even go inside it, you see this is a huge place surrounded by 3 walls. Each wall is higher than the last, and each wall is entirely covered in carvings. That is the amount of effort that had to go into carving all these city-encircling triple walls is just wow. And it's even fancier than that. Quote. That's okay.
Mouse malfunction, the name of my new band. God, this is terrible. It's one of those things where it opened like a program. Okay. The outer gates were banded with copper, the middle with iron, the innermost were studded with golden eyes. All opened at Dany's approach. As she rode her silver into the city, small children rushed out to scatter flowers in her path. They wore golden sandals and bright paint. No more.
So not only is it this fancy place, the greeting itself is elaborate and rich and just, worthy of the fanciness of this city. So, yeah, I mean, she did do something really wondrous. Birthing dragons is probably clears those high standards.
Birthing dragons merits naked children in the streets. Naked painted children in the streets.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And, as it often is with these super rich folk who are trying to impress someone, they kind of try to compete with each other in generosity. Zaro says she can have anything she desires. Pyat Pri's like, Qarth is already yours. Zaro says the 13 will place a crown of black jade and fire opals on her head, which would make for a fantastic Targaryen crown, really. He's thinking smartly there, Zaro. Let's think about these Qarthian factions, though, and these individuals. We need to try to cover every aspect of Qarth right here in this one chapter because, like I said, Dany's going to spend the rest of the book here, so we'll have more opportunities, more explanations, and we'll roll with it as it comes. She's going to eventually leave on the 3 ships sent by Illyrio, and of course, she's going to try to get a lot more ships than those 3, but she doesn't. And of course, she's also trying to get other things than ships, and largely doesn't. And this will come in the same chapter where she rejects marriage to Zarozoan Daxos, meaning getting these 3 ships. So let's speak of him first off. He is one of the 13, a group of merchant princes. Now let's be clear on what a merchant prince is. They're absurdly wealthy from trade, right? Not from war. They have huge operations, perhaps inherited, right? He may have gotten a lot of these businesses from his dad and maybe his dad's dad, and who knows how long his family has held this. Maybe not. Maybe he's the guy that built this up this large. Who knows? The point is he has existing businesses that generate huge amounts of cash. Dany just is astonished how wealthy he is. And they have, the fact is, merchant princes, the implication, the reason it's called prince, they're not literally princes. They just have so much political power because of their wealth and influence that they are the equivalent to a prince in by measure of how much power they have. So the 13 are an extreme case because they're like 13 merchant princes grouping together to wield even more enormous political power. So they're, instead of one ultra-rich, influential lobbyist type, they're, well, 13 influential, rich lobbyist types. So they are part of the de facto rulers of the city, apart from, say, the Pureborn and the Tourmaline Brotherhood and the Guild of Spicers, who were mentioned as the other big power players. The Pureborn are the ones who are actually descended from the kings and queens, and they're the nobility. But it's shown here in Qarth that, unlike Westeros, the wealthy merchant princes have as much power as the nobility, or at least close, whereas in Westeros, that is not necessarily the case. Very few merchants have this much power. So he's maybe a bit of a parallel to Illyrio himself. She goes from one wealthy benefactor to another. Though she doesn't know it yet, wherever she goes in this world, people will be playing the Game of Thrones. When she goes to Slaver's Bay, we see it. And here in Qarth, we see it. In some of these places, it's a very, very old game that people have been playing for centuries or eons, where there's this progression where each generation of leaders is likely to be more corrupt than the last. Because the game gets dirtier the longer it's played. The tricks become known, and so the tricks have to get dirtier because you need to find things that people don't see coming. You get more, there's more cynicism. It's just, well, many of these have grown savagely cynical here in Qarth. I mean, you have ritualized bribery, basically. I mean, it's part of the, it's just so accepted that it's part of the culture. And that's just not a great sign. How can you change a place that's been like this for thousands of years? That's one of the problems that Dany faces when going to these other places in the East, is that they've been set in their ways for so long. It's going to be true in Westeros too, maybe to a lesser extent, but to a more meaningful extent, because these power structures will be arrayed against her and they probably won't accept her. But Dany is going to have the ability to topple these ancient power structures. She's going to have unprecedented ability to bring them down. She has methods and means at her disposal. Maybe not yet. Well, definitely not yet, but eventually. For example, when her dragons are larger and her army is large and diverse, well, just look at what she does in Slaver's Bay. She could have done similar things in Qarth if she had her army at that time. So what she isn't able to do in Qarth, she does do in Slaver's Bay, and maybe she's going to do in Volantis or Pentos or both, or maybe even some other places. By then, she's not just going to have adult dragons, she's going to have Unsullied. She might have a bunch of Relorists following her. And Qarth is still going to be involved, though, even though no one's likely ever going back here after a Clash of Kings. Their political influence is still going to be big. If they knew that she would eventually disrupt the slave trade, that they'd eventually offer her 13 ships to just leave Essos outright, that they'd eventually declare war on her, they'd have killed her here instead. They'd have been like, well, let's take care of this problem before it gets larger. As she puts it herself, she's only got about 4 warriors to her name right now, and her dragons are little babies. It'd have been the easiest thing in the world for them to take her out. But this is just another thing Dany runs into. She flies under the radar, despite everyone knowing who she is. It's about this huge welcome. They still just treat her as a wonder and not as a threat. It's like a, they just look down on her because of her gender and her age and her status. These pureborn think very little of her. Someone just like Zaro sees the angle here. He's thinking ahead. He's thinking, oh yeah, dragon. Yeah, I could do something with that. But the rest of the people just don't think about it that way. So she has prospects here. Qarth is definitely like she thinks. She's right that there's opportunity here. It's not the opportunities don't add up the way she wants, but they are there. But there's also these pitfalls. So we have some parallels as well as these pitfalls. Let's start with the parallels. Xaro talks about the warlocks in a way that reminds us of what has just been said a couple Tyrion chapters ago about the pyromancers. Quote,
"Once they were mighty," Xaro agreed, "but now they are as ludicrous as those feeble old soldiers who boast of their prowess long after strength and skill have left them. They read their crumbling scrolls, drink shade of the evening until their lips turn blue, and hint of dread powers. But they are hollow husks compared to those who went before. Pyat Pre's gifts will turn to dust in your hands, I warn you."
You know, this isn't in my notes, but I just thought of a perfect example of a feeble old warrior who boasts of his prowess long after strength and skill have left him. That guy, Eric, the anvil breaker at the Kingsmoot, the dude who can't even stand up. But he still talks about how, badass he was, Perfect example. But more on point, just like it is with the pyromancers, the old powers are rising. So their power is increasing, the warlocks, with it. But Xaro is still pretty much right here that their gifts will turn to dust, because that's pretty much how the House of the Undying ends up at the end of this Qartheen arc. It dies and pretty much turns to dust. But it's also, but he means it as a metaphor, since it's pretty close, as, don't trust them. That's basically what he means. So, but he says it in a way that becomes prophetic. And several books later, he's right. If you look back on the House of the Undying, what did Dany get out of it? We, the readers, got a lot out of it. There's all these visions that taught us a lot about what's coming. They gave us a lot to talk about. But in terms of benefiting her, have they? I don't know that they have. Like, what decisions has she made based on those visions?
Well, it's a matter of whether they will affect her going forward.
That's true. That's true. It may be that it's just not yet. They haven't come yet, some of them. But she sees things like the Westeros being torn apart. Like, well, yeah, we knew that already. She knows that already. So it's interesting, but we'll talk more about the House of the Undying when we actually get there.
Are you saying George is Captain Obvious there?
Maybe. So it's a good point. Even though we can't trust Xaro, that doesn't mean he's not right about a lot of these things. On the other hand, there's Quaithe. Dany immediately doesn't trust her, in part because of Mirri Maz Duur, and she's wary of magic and stuff. But on the other hand, Quaithe doesn't want anything, at least seemingly, and that's very telling. She only gives warnings. Quote,
"They shall come day and night to see the wonder that has been born again into the world, and when they see, they shall lust. For dragons are fire made flesh, and fire is power."
And she's right. That's, like Xaro, like, even though she doesn't trust Xaro, some of his warnings are accurate. She doesn't trust Quaithe. Some of her warnings are accurate. So far, all of her warnings have been pretty accurate, or haven't come to pass yet. Xaro and the Warlock's ambitions were no doubt kindled from the moment they heard of dragons' existence. What Quaithe is saying is something that they heard of dragons, and they're immediately like, ooh, yeah, fire is power, dragons are power. And they immediately were tempted by that. And their ambition probably only grew once they saw Dany and her meager Khalasar, and were like, oh, opportunity. But Quaithe doesn't seem to see it that way. She doesn't do anything that seems to resemble ambition for dragons or power, not from a personal perspective anyway. If she is after something, it's more of a Varys-style thing where it's not for personal gain. But that's really where the Varys-Quaithe comparisons kind of end, because Quaithe is a highly magical figure, and Varys is opposed to magic.
They're very mysterious.
That's true. They do have that.
And they both, disguise themselves.
And they're both a big part of Dany's arc.
And I have a picture of both of them from Ball at the Wall this weekend, and Instax of them. Varys and Quaithe hanging out.
Nice.
So,
So, I gotta admit, Quaithe is one of the most baffling characters in the series. Perhaps George had still intended for Dany to go to Asshai at this point in the story, and Quaithe was to be part of that. But as the story arc changed, as George changed some of his plans, scrapping the 5-year gap, part of it maybe, so did the purpose of Quaithe as a supporting character. She's from Asshai, and masks are normal there. She sees masked Asshai elsewhere, at Vaes Dothrak, for example. It's not limited to wielders of magic, meaning the masks, that is. The regular old Asshai wear masks. It's just their fashion. At this point,
it's always a masquerade in a shy. It's their slogan.
Yeah, that's right. At this point in the story, glamours were not well understood or even mentioned by name. Of course, by later in the series, they're thoroughly understood, maybe not the mechanism, but the fact that they exist. We haven't even seen Jaqen change his face yet, so we're not there yet. But when Glamries were introduced, a bajillion identity-based theories started appearing. But Quaithe identity theories have been around much longer. Since this book, they've been around, since 1998. Thanks to her mask. It's the same kind of basic device where you don't know for sure who this person is. Just like a glamour can make you unsure, a mask is a more basic way to express that. So what's interesting here is that the new Quaithe identity theories are still coming up. Older theories range from Dany's mother, Rhaella, yes, she died giving birth to her, so that one isn't super well supported, to Shiera Seastar, which is, I'm not a big fan of that theory. I mean, I like it, but I think the evidence is, it's okay. It's not like out of bounds, but I'm not a big believer in that one. But there's a new theory that's come out since Fire and Blood, which is that she's Alyssa Farman or her descendant. Also, I'm not huge on that one, but I definitely recognize it's possible.
What
and
I
hope
like
to learn
about
more.
that one, I mean, I don't think it's the case, but what I do like about it is that it would speak to George's Gardner style.
Yes.
Which is that he could come up with this and then he'd be like, I'm going to write a backstory for this character.
Yeah, you're right. Like, this is like Bloodraven was just imagined as George knew he would be a Targaryen bastard and knew certain things about him, but like so much of the detail in the backstory was written afterwards.
Yeah.
And that could be the same here. And that brings me to the next point, which is Melisandre is super important here because some of Quaithe's role may be crossed up with Melisandre as George changed his plans. Because there's so many aspects to their characters that are similar and seem to serve a related role in terms of narrative and Dany's arc. So Dany's not going to Ashai, we know that, but Melisandre is probably our best portal to learning things about it and its history. And that's obviously important because we're not going to go there. For example, it would have been interesting if the Dragonhorn came from Ashai instead of from Qarth, for example. But did I just say for example? For example, I did. I need to be reported to the Department of Redundancy Department. So there's nothing wrong with the Warlocks having the horn or acquiring it. However they got it, I don't know how they got it, but however they got it, there's nothing wrong with it. But it might have fit better to come from Ashai.
You said it, however, like 3 times right there.
Yeah, I'm just stuck. I need more reporting
to
the Department of Redundancy, Department of Redundancy. So likewise, some of Quaithe's role may have been given to Melisandre, as her one POV chapter reveals that she was sold into slavery as a child and spent a large amount of time, if not most of her life, in Ashai before heading west. So if we're onto something here, if there is a Quaithe-Melisandre overlap in terms of George's original plans that he kind of split later, then it might also follow that Quaithe, like Melisandre, has legitimately genuine motivation to fight against the oncoming darkness. That would certainly explain her otherwise lack of apparent personal ambition or motivation. Quaithe is a Shadowbinder like Mel, but there's no indication she's for R'hllor. But there's also no reason to assume that R'hllor worshippers have a monopoly in Essos when it comes to divining prophecies about the Long Night or Lightbringer or any of these related ideas. In other words, just because Quaithe doesn't worship R'hllor, doesn't mean she can't be aware of what's coming, of the coming Long Night. In fact, it seems that she is aware of it, at least at some level. So we know that there's many versions of the story told by Salladhor Saan to Davos regarding Azor Ahai. You know, as the world has expanded around us through future books, especially things like The World of Ice and Fire come in big here, there are similar stories where the hero has a different name depending on which culture you're talking about. Azor Ahai has a bunch of different names that seem to be all referring to maybe the same person, but maybe not. That's a different topic that we've gotten into in other places. The point is here that Quaithe could have seen the future using different means than Mel, but reached a similar conclusion, and his acting on her information just as Melisandre is in order to save the world. She's guiding she's guiding Azor Ahai as she sees it. Because Quaithe could think that Dany is Azor Ahai. Maybe she uses a different name. Maybe she thinks of Dany as Eldrick Shadow Chaser or one of the other, or Yntar or something like that. Probably not. But the point is, Quaithe is where Mel should be. Mel should be supporting Daenerys, not Stannis. She's either intentionally promoting the wrong candidate until the real one emerges, or just at this point actually thinks she's supporting the right candidate but is wrong. Either way, you can see these parallels. But This also ties into what we were talking about in the Theon chapter, relating to the origins of the oily black stone, which appears in other places like Sothorios and Ashai, which is of course very important. So you go from all the way from the Ashai to the Iron Islands, like basically the two extreme ends of the known world and the extreme south with Sothorios. All of these super remote and extreme areas. And this also relates to Dany's ancestor dreams, the ones that go back before the Targaryens to an era far more ancient and unknown.
Do you think they were also incestors?
Quite possibly. That's how they kept all the hair color and gemstone eyes for so long. And she dreams of gemstone eyes and pale swords of pale fire and hair colors that are similar to hers, but not exactly the same, and with more variety than we see amongst the Valyrians typically, from what we've seen anyway, which is only part of why we think that they are not Valyrians or even Targaryens, but something far more ancient. With Mel and Quaithe, given their association with Ashai and this connection to these ancient parts of Dany's story, plus this amazing world building in George R. R. Martin, in history George R. R. Martin has imagined long ago, he's fleshed these things out, expanded on them, and it only makes us want to know more. It's funny, it's like the more he adds, the more we want to know. It's like, no, you're not quenching our thirst, you're making us more thirsty. Now, 2 of our most popular episodes in our 7+ years of podcasting are on Ashai and the Great Empire of the Dawn. So check them out if you haven't, or check them out again if you have, because maybe now you have some new thoughts on them, or maybe we've maybe alerted you to more reasons why this is important. I bet a lot of y'all were surprised to find Oily Black Stone mentioned this early in the novels, and to see how many of these other little details through Quaithe and Melisandre and other stuff about Ashai is all here. So yeah, George hadn't fully expanded on him, but those seeds were planted really early, 1998-ish. So Mel is, like I said, a strong candidate to reveal more about Ashai. Quaithe could too. She's in Dany's head still giving visions, or maybe using glass candles. We're not entirely clear on how these visions are being ported over, but more on that later. We also have Marwyn, who is, last we saw at the end of Feast for Crows, was heading toward Dany, but we haven't seen him arrive yet. Point being, though, if he does show up to Dany, and Quaithe has indicated that, then maybe there's more ability for us to hear about Ashai, because Marwyn's been there too. Another one who might have things to say about Ashai is Euron himself. Maybe. A few other minor candidates, like the sailors on the Cinnamon Wind, could drop a line or two about Ashai as well, and that brings us full circle back to the meat of this chapter rather than this vast subtext and world building that's been expanded on later. The Cinnamon Wind. It's a wonderful little dot to connect. Sam and Gilly and Aemon take a ride on this very ship to Old Town in A Feast for Crows, which, of course, also has a connection to the Great Empire and the Oily Black Stone. But hey, I'm trying to come back full circle here. Stop it, Great Empire. Stop interrupting me with your awesomeness. We're talking about Daenerys 2, A Clash of Kings. Related, but not directly involved. The captain's daughter is named Koja Mo, captain of the Cinnamon Wind, that is. And we named one of our cats after her, Koja Mew. She's the one that gets through to Sam about loving Gilly, properly loving Gilly. But she doesn't appear until Feast. For now, we just get her father, Kahurumo, who brings the news to Dany that Robert is dead. And then they have a conversation that includes this particular exchange, quote,
"When does your ship return to Westeros, Captain?"
"Not for a year or more, I fear. From here, the Cinnamon Wind sails east to make the traders circle around the Jade Sea." So circling around the Jade Sea is why we think there's a decent chance he's been to Ashai, right? That's part of what seems to be part of the circle. We don't have a full description of what that actually means, but if you draw a circle around the Jade Sea, it would include Ashai probably. So we do, of course, and of course later we see the Cinnamon Wind in Bravos. Like I said, that's when Sam and Gilly and Aemon get on. So the news of Robert's death is not fresh, but it is important. It kind of inspires Dany to, she's already pretty confident and pushing forward with her great goals here, but it's still a nice little boost to her morale to hear that Robert is dead. And subconsciously, she probably also realizes that this maybe makes the throne a little more ripe for the taking because, hey, it's Joffrey, a young kid, on the throne instead of experienced warrior. And Dany doesn't realize how weak Robert became and how bad a ruler he is. He seems like, to her, he's this kind of imposing warrior type that slew her brother and overthrew her father. He doesn't realize that he became a kind of a drunken wastrel later. And there's also this interesting quote from Jorah.
Ned Stark a traitor? Ser Jorah snorted. Not bloody likely. His long summer will come again before that one would besmirch his precious honor.
That seems like very deliberate language, or if it's not, it's certainly a coincidence. It's ironic because Ned did falsely admit treason to save his daughter, and of course he lied about Jon being his, which was a stain on his honor, as perceived by the world around him. We know that it was a noble, honorable, necessary thing to protect Jon. Arguments about whether he should have told Catelyn aside, it's seen, the truth is a different story than the way it's perceived. Point being, he did besmirch his precious honor. So Jorah's, projecting a bit because of, his own thoughts on Ned. But perhaps more importantly, the notion, this casual quote of the long summer will come again before that one, blah, 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 blah. The long summer is deeply tied to Dany's arc as the savior of humankind. I've pointed out Benero before, many times before, and here's another time where we need to point to him. He's the high priest of R'hllor and Volantis, and he names Dany Azor Ahai and claims those following her will see her bring on the long summer. And it says, it's just like this. He says, quote,
and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that will never end.
It's that exact summer that will never end that she kind of refers to on the TV show in a way that really freaks out Jon and leads to, the full resolution, I'm doing finger quotes, of Azor Ahai, the show's version. But still, some version of that is not unlikely in the books, though the details and the path we take to get there will probably be very, very different. The point about her ushering or threatening to usher in the opposite of a winter that will never end, a summer that will never end, that both involves people not dying. Yeah, that doesn't sound great either. Maybe only a little better than a winter that will never end. It's pretty bad. Gahoro Mo knows that she is called Stormborn, that she has that nickname, and that makes us wonder, where did she get that nickname? We know why she has the nickname, because there was a storm the day she was born, but who actually dubbed her that?
Yeah, and it seems like a good decision. Like, if you wanted her to be a ruler or to be, some sort of figure in bringing these Targaryens back, that you would brand her Stormborn,
Yeah.
So but whether someone did that because of that, my best guess is Derry.
Yeah, William Derry does sound like a good guess because, like you said, when we were talking about this offline, it probably wasn't Viserys, and there just really aren't that many other candidates.
Yeah, only other people I thought of were Varys and Illyrio, and they don't have that much motivation to do that, to brand her in such a way, market her.
Yeah, because their original plan was Fagon. Although maybe they did to make her bigger distraction. But
I don't know.
That seems a bit of a stretch.
And even so, Viserys was ahead of her, but I think it adds some clout, some whatever to their cause, like Daenerys Stormborn. I don't know.
Yeah, good point. She thinks of how she wants good things for her people. She had briefly considered restoring Vaes Teloro at one point, but as we're told later, dragons don't plant trees. And we're told much earlier that neither do Dothraki. The World of Ice and Fire clarifies that it's a religious thing for them to not plant and till the earth. They think it's just anathema. They think it's, they don't do that. And here's a related line that looms hugely, not just for the Dothraki, but for Dany's future. Quote,
the Dothraki sacked cities and plundered kingdoms. They did not rule them. Dany had no wish to reduce King's Landing to a blackened ruin full of unquiet ghosts. She had supped enough on tears. I want to make my kingdom beautiful, to fill it with fat men and pretty maids and laughing children. I want my people to smile when they see me ride, the way Viserys said they smiled for my father. But before she could do that, she must conquer.
So there, real quick, before we get into the meat of that quote, is what we referred to in the last chapter with Arya and the guy, the old man who wishes that Aerys was still in charge. Here's another person. This is Viserys probably telling the truth for once about how they did appreciate Aerys because, well, even though he doesn't necessarily deserve credit for it, on the surface, it appeared that his realm was peaceful from a commoner's point of view. But still, the big part here is, wow, right? She does not want to reduce King's Landing to a blackened ruin full of unquiet ghosts. Hello, that's foreshadowing. But how do we get from her wanting to make her kingdom beautiful to the intentional destruction of a city? Notice I use the word intentional because we've been very much entertaining the notion along the way from the very beginning of our reread that, yeah, there's a lot of clues that King's Landing will be destroyed in a manner somewhat similar to the show, but there's a lot of other clues that it won't be her intent like it was in the show. In this case, we have a lot of reason to believe that there'll be an accident, wildfire related perhaps, but that she'll be blamed for it, regardless of her intent. So that's a huge little factor here. A huge little factor.
That's like when we were in Ireland hearing, that's a wee big box.
Jumbo shrimp. And wrapped up in all this is Dany's lack of experience. She says she must conquer, and wanting peace and prosperity is very much at odds with conquest. She hasn't seen conquest yet. She's seen Dothraki pillaging, and she maybe tells herself that oh, that's different than conquest. Conquest is going to be a lot nicer. It's going to be a lot smoother and less brutal. But that's just not true. I mean, it's not as bad as the Dothraki way, but it's not a lot better. It's still really brutal and causes the death of many, many innocents. So it's true that King's Landing can be taken without burning it to the ground, but that doesn't mean it will. Yeah, there's middle grounds between those extremes, but Dany doesn't have that nuance. She doesn't know because, well, she's 13. When she says, I'm a young girl who doesn't know the ways of war, it's a tactic to continue to make her enemies believe that she's worth underestimating. She's playing on their patriarchal beliefs.
Wait, when did you say she was 13?
Did I? Is she not 13?
She's 15.
Oh, she's 15 already?
She says, she's like, I've only counted 15 name days.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
I thought she was 13 at the beginning of the story. She's aged 2 years already?
I know it's weird, but I took note specifically that she says in this chapter that she's reached 15 name days. Remember it's that line where she's talking about how she's older than the crones of the Dosh Catelyn and younger and as young as her dragons. And you're like, okay, Daenerys,
well, regardless, 13 and 15 not a big difference.
No,
the point is
young.
she says I'm a young girl to kind of to fool these guys into staying patriarchal about her. Like they're like, yeah, playing into their already their beliefs about her. But it's also true in a sense that she's naive in terms of the long-term effects of war. Maybe she's got some clever strategies. She understands more than she lets on, but she doesn't have any experience ruling, and she doesn't have much experience seeing the long-term effects of her policies or anyone's policies. She doesn't even really know how her father ruled. She only has like tidbits and like, oh, the commoners liked my father, but that doesn't tell you very much. It doesn't tell you like how he ruled. It doesn't tell you like, it's not like Aragorn's tax policy, right? That old concept. How did he do these things? So just as the pyromancers and warlocks have some things in common, we have reason to think of that comparison as the warlocks will show her the future at the House of the Undying, while Tyrion show us how she might accidentally cause this damage, meaning the wildfire caches. So just as their power may be now on the rise, and the pyromancers will be as well, as in very soon Helene is going to ask Tyrion, are there new dragons in the world? And Qarth is going to echo this by telling Dany that her dragon's rebirth is causing other weak mages, not just the pyromancers and the warlocks, but just like street magic, are just going to start showing more power.
Street magic.
So there's a little interesting tidbit here when Dany is first getting settled in at Zarazo and Daxos' manse. Even when she's relaxing, she's still just thinking ahead and planning and plotting her future. Here's the quote.
The water was deliciously cool, and the pool was stocked with tiny golden fish that nibbled curiously at her skin and made her giggle. It felt good to close her eyes and float, knowing she could rest as long as she liked. She wondered whether Aegon's Red Keep had a pool like this, and fragrant gardens full of lavender and mint. It must, surely. Viserys had always said the Seven Kingdoms were more beautiful than any other place in the world.
So that's not true.
No, Qarth is spectacular.
Qarth is there's not Westeros has nothing on Qarth. Now maybe like the ethics of the people. You take away the people, you're not so sure because Qarth seems like a very corrupt society, but so is Westeros.
I mean, yeah, we've seen some people in Qarth. I'm sure there's so many great people.
Qarth is arguably worse in some ways because it has slavery and stuff like that, but it also has more culture, more cosmopolitan. There's a lot more diversity. So but definitely there is nothing that looks like Qarth in King's Landing. Nothing even remotely close to those walls and the buildings. Yeah. Nothing is old, hardly. I mean, there are things as old, but the things that are as old in Westeros are not fancy. Like the High Tower maybe is an exception. The High Tower isn't really fancy. It's just impressive.
Yeah, it's impressive.
The Eyrie is fancy, but it's not old. I mean, not compared to, it's not Qarth old. And I just imagine there are lots of Eyries type buildings in Qarth, and much, much older. But also like I said before, Ashea read the quote. Notice how she's just thinking of how nice it is, but immediately she thinks of the Red Keep. It's just like, I wonder, this is a really nice pool. I wonder if the Red Keep has a pool like this. But no, it doesn't have a pool like that. It doesn't have gardens full of lavender and mint. No, Shirley is what Dany thinks, but no, surely not. So this is important because it shows her that, Dany's ideas of Westeros are very wrong. They're very, they're a product of what Viserys has told her. And Viserys is, he's a crazy person. And not an honest person either. So, and Jorah has a wonderfully interesting quote here that fits super well with the theme of this chapter.
Sweet smells are sometimes used to cover foul ones.
Yeah.
It fits with other things, too. We were talking about Tywin.
Yeah, it is very true for Tywin, yes.
And I also thought a bit of Varys because obviously he, makes himself very fragrant with these sweet smells, but he has some foulness to him and his little birds and his
personality.
Plans,
yeah, you're right. Yeah, especially, you're right. There's nothing worse than his little birds in terms of pointing to the foulness of Varys. That's the peak of his awfulness, of his stench.
But yes, we also see it here in Qarth, of course.
Yeah, and it's funny that Jorah brings that up. And we'll get to that in a minute here. Qarth is a complete opposite from what Dany has experienced so far. It's going from nomadic life, sleeping on the floor, sleeping in her saddle, to just Xaro's manse and this decadence of Qarth and all this other stuff. She goes from a desert to coming into this. I mean, it's just a massive difference. It's really hard to find a bigger contrast than this. I mean, compared to like Harrenhal or something, which we just saw, it's so vastly different. And Harrenhal is an interesting example because the level of effort to build Harrenhal, the resources, and the fact that it was basically slavery that built Harrenhal, just like it's basically slavery that built Qarth, because it's the thralls and Harren's taking of captives to make his castle. So that's similar, but he didn't care about making it look nice. He wanted it to look intimidating and big and huge. It's not fancy looking like anything in Qarth. So this is another example where Daenerys is learning new customs and new culture and kind of incorporating it all in her outlook and her path, like bringing different cultures together. It's part of the Azor Ahai mythos of uniting different cultures to face the darkness. And it's just the beginning, though, because at this point, she doesn't have a big army. It's just the start here. So, back to Jorah's reluctance to go to the docks. It's really interesting. This is huge in light of what happens later. Let's jump ahead to A Storm of Swords, Dany 6, for a quote. When Dany confronts Jorah about his eventual treachery. Quote, I made one report from Qarth, but...
From Qarth? Dany had been hoping it had ended much earlier. What did you write from Qarth? That you were my man now? That you wanted no more of their schemes? Ser Jorah could not meet her eyes. When Khal Drogo died, you asked me to go with you to Yi Ti and the Jade Sea. Was that your wish or Robert's?
That was to protect you, he insisted, to keep you away from them. I knew what snakes they were. So that's kind of funny too, because I just at the beginning I pointed out how all this snake symbolism that's present in Qarth. So he brings her to a city that's just as snaky, if not more so, even though Dany's more of an unknown commodity here in Qarth. It's only a short matter of time before they know who she is and start coming for her. So it's not better for her, really. She's not more protected in Qarth, really. But Jorah. So what's Jorah doing here? Was he avoiding the docks because he knew he'd be tempted to send this message his last message? It's interesting to consider his own point of view here and whether he struggled with that and he just thought, no, don't send me to the docks because then I'm going to have to, then I got to continue to, play both sides. But if you just keep me nearby, I won't have a chance to do that and I won't have that temptation. I don't know, but that's my best guess. But look how Varys actually reports the message. You see Varys' manipulation. He definitely does not present it in a way that's meant to be taken seriously. Look at this. A Storm of Swords, Tyrion 3, quote.
Sailors back from the Jade Sea report that a 3-headed dragon has hatched in Qarth and is the wonder of that city.
And the line ends there. It's interrupted. Varys is interrupted because Tywin jumps in to say, I'm not interested in dragons. He also says, I'm not interested in krakens because Varys mentions it alongside reports of an actual kraken taking down an Ibonese whaler, which is just a way of making it seem even less important and just a piece of news from afar. Now, if Varys had delivered the real news that it's Daenerys Targaryen hatching 3 dragons, which he no doubt knows, then Tywin might have cared. But Varys is like, oh, this is all we heard, this rumor, So, of course, Tywin's going to dismiss that because it sounds like just nonsense. And sailors like Kahura Mo, again, who we mentioned earlier in this chapter, he brings the news to Old Town as well. Maybe not just him directly, but lots of other sailors, because sailors pass through Qarth a lot. It's a huge trade destination, so they're all going to be hearing about this Dragon Queen, or at least this Mother of Dragons. She maybe isn't called the Dragon Queen yet by a lot of people, but that term is coming soon enough. But aside from, that's newsworthy. That's the kind of thing that people would love to gossip about. So that's why we get it at the beginning of A Feast for Crows. In the prologue, they talk about dragons, and they mention Qarth repeatedly. So Qarth remains important, even though we probably won't see it directly again. Well, we will in the rest of Dany's arc of this book. After the book. All right, some more random thoughts and comments from y'all. Minge Forever points out that the scene where Dany's floating in Xaro's manse in the pool is sort of a reference to the Water Gardens, or at least a reminiscent of the Water Gardens, which is perhaps a big part of Dany's arc in our Rhoynar series, which we've done 2 out of the 3 episodes so far. But we've covered the part that relates to this, which is that there is some evidence, which I present in that episode, that the Water Gardens are going to get torched. So it's not exactly a happy reference.
So she might see something at least somewhat beautiful, like these pools.
Yeah, that's true. They do. They're not in the Red Keep, but they do exist.
Yeah.
And they may not be beautiful when she's done with them. Here's another one that puzzles me. Just like the Renly dwarf dwarf example at their feast where they used the Kingslayer thing. This line that she says at the last line of the chapter, she says, "Dragons die, but so do dragon slayers." I really don't know what to make of that. So I would love to hear what y'all think. Whether it's maybe a reference to Jon, because Jon is maybe, I don't know if Jon's a dragon slayer unless you think of him as killing Dany. Yeah. So it's a metaphorical dragon slayer, and Jon himself dies.
Yeah, that's my thought, is that you can look at it as who will kill a dragon, like an actual dragon, and who will or has killed, a dragon. Like Robert, for example, obviously is a dragon slayer because he killed Rhaegar.
Yes.
And he just died. And so there's that. But then if you're looking to the future, thinking about that is interesting, because obviously what we saw in the show about the dragons dying clearly is not what will happen in actuality.
Yeah. That's a good point. So it's a kind of an oblique reference, but I think maybe we have, I think that's probably accurate relating it to Jon. But we're open to other ideas. Hit us with your thoughts if you have them. Let's talk a little bit about appearances. Again, we need to keep our show book canon straight. Here's what Xaro looks like.
Xaro was a languid, elegant man with a bald head and a great beak of a nose, crusted with rubies, opals, and flakes of jade.
And he's tall and pale. Well, Xaro was a summer islander who had migrated to Qarth on the show. So, I don't mind that change. They wanted to get a little more, diversity in there, which is cool. It's not a big deal. That's a fine channel.
And he had that kind of smoothness, too. Whereas I have to call out the audiobooks for this when we were listening to this in the car. And the voice that Roy Joe Treese gives Xaro is so guttural and, gruff.
Yeah.
When he's such a smooth kind of man. He's languid, elegant man.
Yeah, I agree. I think he chose the wrong voice for that. We took a few other quotes here. The world building here, and it's going to relate us to Pyat Pree, who, Pyat Pree kind of looks like the TV version. It's not a big difference, tall, pale, blue lips. That's basically what the TV show actor looked like. Let's take a quote here.
Pyat Pree conducted her little Khalasar down the center of a great arcade, where the city's ancient heroes stood thrice life-size on columns of white and green marble. They passed through a bazaar in a cavernous building whose latticework ceiling was home to 1,000 gaily colored birds. Trees and flowers bloomed on the terraced walls above the stalls, while below it seemed as if everything the gods had put into the world was for sale.
Yeah, she's thinking about how gigantic the market is, and this is another expression of just how incredible Qarth is, but also just how connected and part of the huge regional trade network in the center of it, really, because they control the Jade Gates, which is the narrow enclosure between Qarth and Great Morak. So it's basically access to the Jade Sea is kind of controlled in that little strait there. So with a modest navy, Qarth can tax things kind of like the Stepstones does taxing, but it's a different style of taxation, and there's no trade in the Stepstones. It's pretty much just piracy and taxation through violence. But the concept is somewhat similar in that they're controlling an important trade spot. Here's another line that really makes us think, and it comes up with some more stuff about Pyat Pree.
Qarth is the greatest city that ever was or ever will be, Pyat Pree had told her back amongst the bones of Vaes Toloro. It is the center of the world, the gate between north and south, the bridge between east and west, ancient beyond memory of man, and so magnificent that Sathos the Wise put out his eyes after gazing upon Qarth for the first time, because he knew that all he saw thereafter should look squalid and ugly by comparison.
Now, I seriously doubt some dude cut his own eyes out because of how amazing Qarth looked. He would probably no, I want to keep these eyes so I can keep looking at how amazing it is.
But I do think it's interesting to wonder about who this Sathos the Wise was. And we had two guesses. Yeah. One is obvious. One, Sarnor. They have a bunch of 2A, S2A names like Soth and all that. But obviously in Lys we have Salador San.
So more SAA type names.
But with how ancient it was, I have this. So I would like to think that it's something with Sarnor.
Yeah.
Because of that, and the way he's like Sathos the Wise, it seems like such a kind of mythical story.
It sounds like a really ancient figure, so I agree with that guess because the Lysine are more of a much newer culture than the Sarnori. So I definitely go with your interpretation there. Here is another kind of interesting reference here about, we're going back to talk about the walls for a second.
The innermost wall was 50 feet of black marble with carvings that made Dany blush until she told herself that she was being a fool. She was no maid. If she could look upon the gray wall's scenes of slaughter, why should she avert her eyes from the sight of men and women giving pleasure to one another? And obviously that's a huge commentary on something George feels very strongly about, which is, why do we care? Like, why is Americans so puritanical when and so violent? It's ridiculous.
Why are we so?
Sex is all good. Violence is bad on the spectrum of things. It's ridiculous.
And we got a quote from, or a comment rather, from Archmaester Renly on Flick, who said this could be a nod to how traditional censoring TV has worked in that violence has always been more acceptable than nudity, which is basically what you just said.
Yeah, he's brought it up many
George
times.
brought that up,
because people criticize him, like, why is there so much sex? And he's like, why do you care? And why are you not complaining about the violence then?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point by George, and I agree that that's probably what he's making a point of here. So that's neat. Here's another just fascinating. We just pulled this quote just because it sounds.
Yeah,
awesome.
I love the first. Whoops.
We're such world building nerds, so you guys knew that we were gonna spend a little extra time in Qarth.
Yeah, I love this first line. I think it's so poetic. All the colors that had been missing from Vase Teloro had found their way to Qarth. Buildings crowded about her, fantastical as a fever dream, in shades of rose, violet, and umber. She passed under a bronze arch fashioned in the likeness of two snakes mating, their scales delicate flakes of jade, obsidian, and lapis lazuli. Slim towers stood taller than any Dany had ever seen, and elaborate fountains filled every square, wrought in the shape of griffins and dragons and manticores.
Interesting, the griffins and dragons and manticores sounds very similar to the way Dragonstone is decorated, but of course it's a different type of stone most likely used. And Slim Tower is taller than she's ever seen. Well, when she sees the high tower, assuming she does, she'll see one that's even taller. But again, we see the snakes mating here, the likeness of the bronze arch fashioned in the likeness of two snakes mating. So there's yet again snake imagery in Qarth, which certainly seems to be a pattern that George has given them. Something from their ancient past, perhaps. So yeah, there's not a whole lot to say about that other than that. It's just a really awesome, like Ashaya said, it's just beautifully written, and we love it. Mother Tribbles had a great quote, or another, I keep calling our listener comments quotes. Well, it is about 2:30 in the morning. Mother Tribbles says, what about this so-called ointment that lets one see spirits of the air? Yeah, Varro gives this to Dany, a so-called ointment that lets her see the spirits of the air. And so she wants to know if that comes up anywhere else. The ointment does not. But the spirits of the air themselves are mentioned. At least it's like a concept elsewhere than Qarth. In A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion 5, when they're in the mist, entering the sorrows where, Grayscale was perhaps born into the world, Ysilla says, there are restless spirits in the air here and tormented souls below the water. And farther back, also in Tyrion, but Game of Thrones Tyrion 1, of all places, we get a humorous reference here when Sandor is mocking Tyrion, pretending to not know where Tyrion's voice is coming from. He says, quote,
a voice from nowhere, Sandor said. He peered through his helm, looking...
But you're still an ethereal spirit of the air. Our good friend Michael, who we've podcasted with both of those guys. Good stuff. And we would like to tell you what's coming up next week. It's going to start off with Bran 4, the one where Jojen explains green jeans. Let me try that again.
I have a pair of green jeans.
Yeah, let me back up, not just to repeat that because I goofed it, but also to point out that Ashaya pointed out to me that not every It's Always Sunny episode has to have the phrase "the gang blankety blank." So I opened up it a little bit more.
Yeah, I made a nice little list of some of the titles I think might work out later.
And I immediately made use of some of them while also expanding the concept a little further into, you'll see. Bran 4, the one where Jojen explains green dreams, a.k.a. dances with direwolves.
Tyrion 7, Lancel Lannister, an erotic life, a.k.a. the one where Tyrion steals Cersei's plaything.
Arya 7, the gang gathers at Harrenhal, a.k.a. the one where Jaqen is a killer genie.
Catelyn 3, the one with Stannis and Renly's banter battle, a.k.a. F. Lightbringer versus a peach.
Sansa 3, King Robb, the sauce boss of Oxcross, a.k.a. the one where Tyrion rescues Sansa.
Sorry, a couple people said the stream crashed, but I'm very confused about that. Other people aren't saying it. Sorry, I will just continue. We're at the very end. Catelyn 4, the one where, what? A shadow? AKA the gang switches Baratheons.
Cat 3 is the third chapter next week, and that's the actual halfway point, which kind of adds weight to what I said about the length of these early chapters. So we'll be at chapter 31 with Catelyn 3 and already halfway through the book, even though by number of chapters, 35 would be the halfway point. So a full 4 chapters earlier than the chapter count halfway point. So that tells you something about the way this book is distributed in its chapters. So we will see you all next time, I hope. Ashea and I thank you for coming. Very big thanks to our live attendees who submitted questions and comments and jokes and just made the whole experience more communal. Thanks also, equal thanks to our patrons whose without your bottom line support, none of this would be possible. Thanks to Joe Buckley for adding his great thoughts to our episode. Very thorough, and of course he covers these chapters on his own, trying to pick out things that we didn't necessarily touch on, other thoughts, other explanations on his show called The Isle of Faces. His editions of Valar Rereadis are called Scraps and Scrolls. Also thanks to our wonderful History of Westeros mods that continue to drive the discussions on Facebook by posting the chapters individually and leading discussions that include artwork and reflecting our goofy chapter alternate titles. Thanks to all the rest of the Facebook contributors and Flick contributors, Tree Girl and Nina and Stefan B. and all the rest of you who have been very thorough and very useful in helping us make sure we don't miss things. And if you didn't get named, we still appreciate you, and maybe we'll name you on a future episode.
And thanks to our patient kitties sitting here meowing.
Yes, they're just really waiting for us to interact with them. Understand, we've been around a while, but you'd be surprised how much word of mouth still counts and how much, reviewing us and rating us on iTunes matters. So we appreciate all your support in any form that it takes. And well, we will see you next time, everybody. Valar Rereadis.